This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people have so much to gain and have such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come above board to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, yeah? Yes.
Ooh, welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 285. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
Yes, and today, right out the gate, we got with us a real homie, back after his appearance on the 5-year anniversary special, Marcus from the Return of the Repressed. How you doing, Marcus?
Hello, guys. Thank you.
I'm actually glad you did that because I always feel awkward when we introduce ourselves and then the guest has to
I realized today we just gotta go straight into the guest.
Sometimes it takes a while.
Yeah.
No, I'm very happy to be here. I didn't say that last time. We were so pressed for time, and it was like a crazy
we have a bit more time today, not as much as I would like, so maybe we should get into the topic because we'll see how long we're able to go because we're starting a bit late, as I'm sure since we're live, the listeners will be noticing that we're getting going a little bit late.
Marcus, you were graciously joining us from Japan, halfway across the world.
I guess early in the morning right now, right?
Yeah, literally from the future, and you came to us. We were plotting an ep or a series of eps, and you came to us with a very interesting topic, a broad and complex topic from deep history to chew on. And so today, I think we're going to get into sort of the first leg of this journey, which is going to be about ancient Greece and antiquity, and we sort of tentatively titled this or I went rogue and modified it to Dialectics of Imperial Collapse, and right. So I know, even though
it's a good title, sounds like I told you, industrial ambient album or something.
Right. This is some kind of like dark noise techno kind of thing. So I guess what are we trying to evoke with Dialectics of Imperial Collapse, and if you could, in a kind of overview sense, Marcus, could you tell us what are we kind of exploring here in terms of the big view of, say, we're going to go on to subsequent. I think we plan on talking about Rome next, and
I
then
feel like we should disclose that this is a little bit of an unusual episode because, and Dimitri and I were quite surprised by this, but Marcus wrote a somewhat lengthy essay. There's no footnotes, but it is a somewhat lengthy piece of writing. About the topic for the episode. So I feel rather than pretend that didn't happen, the conversation will be easier if we acknowledge that there is an essay that Marcus has written. So but maybe summarize your thoughts in your essay.
Yes, this essay, which was titled "First as Tragedy, Then as Farce: The Fall of Greece and the Fall of Rome, a Masterclass in Dialectics." Yeah, great title. But I don't know. Yeah, maybe if you want to summarize some of your thoughts or the kind of thesis of this, it could help us get going.
So, because last time when we were talking, I came across this morbid detail, right, of the cadaver trial, And I was thinking, like, two big things have been popular maybe for like the last, how long has it been now? It's like almost 12 years, right? We've had like cadaver presidents, basically, right? Like artificially kept alive, like both Biden and Trump, on like, drugs that they didn't have back then. But this latest picture of like Trump, with the eyes, is like, it's really uncanny. Like, is there really a person? Like, or is this a cadaver?
Yeah, that's funny thinking about him as a cadaver pope. Yeah.
And in addition to that, there is all this talk about, like, especially from like Janusz Varoufakis, how we're entering, right, the techno-feudalism.
Good.
I was thinking,
you're right. Yeah.
And then, like, so if we want to understand the cadaver tribe, we want to understand feudalism, was my thinking, we have to understand like the fall of Rome. And then, of course, when I start getting into the fall of Rome, I remember, to understand that, we have to understand Greece, right?
Of course.
So that's like how the paper came to be. And I guess that's like the good thing when you interview other podcasters, is that you you get like episodes written for you. Sometimes, I guess.
It's true, yeah. In the best case scenarios.
Yeah.
But usually we don't. Like
you are exceptional.
I don't think that ever
Marcus.
usually happens. I don't think anyone ever does that.
Okay.
Or sometimes they've written something in general, and then we use that as like a jumping off point, like the Symposia, 200 page.
Yeah, they incidentally wrote something else, but not like for the purposes of the episode.
We love Symposia.
Right.
But yeah, I'm grateful and impressed that you followed this kind of thread from zombie Trump all the way, like, through the mists of quote unquote feudalism back to ancient Greece to find the origin of the crime, as it were, the class crime.
Yeah. I mean, like, as like kind of like a medieval historian, like like when I hear like the word feudalism, I'm kind of like programmed to like bristle a little bit, because like now, like, as I was talking about Dimitri a little bit, like, feudalism is kind of like seen as like not, like it's kind of like a construct that's like sort of been like jettisoned from like the field of like medieval historiography. Like, it's only like really invoked like maybe kind of like allegorically, or like, as a provocation or something like that. So it's like it's kind of this almost like shibboleth thing of like, are you a medievalist? Like, do you believe in feudalism? Or like, do you like think that medieval Europe was feudal, or like believe in a feudal system? But at the same time, I think like as like comes up, like obviously like the quote unquote feudal mode of production is like a big like Marxist concept. And I think in your essay, like, you're dealing like very heavily with like these Marxist ideas of, the slave mode of production, and of like the idea of feudalism. And I think that, what part of the critique of the concept of feudalism, or part of what has like sort of emerged in this critique of the concept of feudalism from people like Reynolds, etc., and Fiefs and Vassals and all that stuff, like I think part of it is like, this is like kind of in some ways like a 19th century construct that is really relative to the dynamics of the 19th century, things that was sort of created in order to situate the dynamics that were observed in the 19th century in like a historical context. And therefore, like, really what feudalism applies to best in a lot of cases are sort of the dynamics that still exist like today, that were present in that context. And so in that respect, like, I think that terms like techno-feudalism kind of do make sense in a way, because like more than like a sort of descriptive term, or a useful sort of a rubric for analyzing medieval society, I feel like feudalism in some ways like is almost more apposite to describing the present in many respects, or the modern period. But I mean, that's something that we can like kind of talk about as we go.
Do you mean the present by like mid 18th century, mid 19th century onward kind of present, or like present.
Yeah, or like, you know,
today.
yeah, or and all, like, you know, it's today as well, but yeah, like mid 19th century onward, like you know, from
because I have to admit, sorry, you can go ahead, Marcus.
Okay, I will go. Like I was thinking, like, you know, the mainly in the books that I've read about like feudalism, the some of those what was the latest one now? The I didn't add this one in this episode, but the Marxist big book on feudalism by, is it Williamson? I have to check again, like my phone is using the camera, so I can't check it. But I think like what he addresses is the I would think like feudalism as a mode of production is more relevant than, let's say, like medieval or dark ages or middle ages as terms, only because it like, again, from this kind of approach of dialectical materialism, where both medieval and dark ages and middle ages all suggest this kind of teleology, right? And this is how I opened up the paper, that the medieval times already knew where they were going somehow, that they were preparing the conditions for capitalism, which I think is wrong, right? Whereas, of course, from a sort of like superstructural point of view, maybe there is no real thing as feudalism, because then usually people think of like, I don't know, knights in shining armor or something, or that there was like a real consciousness of how the estate system worked, rather than just a sort of like consequence of like everyday life, that there was like, you know, that they adhered to it with a sort of like
that they knew of feudalism in the way that we know of capitalism, like no one in the like, you know, in the and again, we could say like pre-modern, but you know, again, I mean, you are correct that like certainly the Dark Ages is not like a term that is correct, and you know, medieval is imperfect, and it really only fits Europe, and like in a very in a kind of an imperfect way. A lot of the time people talk about like medieval Islam and those things, where it's like, okay, well, in the middle of what is medieval Islam, right. You know? And so you can definitely see the problems with the idea of the medieval too.
I think it comes a lot from the late classicism of the Baroque, right, before Romanticism, where you especially have a lot of like German historians who are sort of very, and we're going to see this towards the end, I think, of the paper, that like I didn't go that hard, but I'm like inclined to do it. That there is like this, there was a sense among like German historians to hate upon Rome, which I think is like very foreign to us today, because usually when people look back on the antique today, especially right-wingers and conservatives love Rome, and but then like the classicists before Romanticism, they were more into Greece than they were into Rome. And then Rome is sort of the destroyer of that whole like Hellenistic legacy. And then I think that's also where medieval sort of this concept of the medievals comes for the first time, right? But I think maybe we should discuss that more in like the next episode, and like lay the groundwork then to like the best of like our capacity about like what was it that happened before. And I think like the initial thing to like remember, or at least something that I think was very interesting for me, was that capitalism did like develop somewhat gradually out of feudalism, like, which is another, I guess, indication that feudalism wasn't really a thing, because then it would have necessarily had to collapse for the next mode of production to develop out of it. Though there are sometimes incidents or let's say periods where a gradual quantitative change can take place. Of course, it was also very disruptive, but it go.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, more than that, I would almost say that, like, in what respect, like, this is more interesting to me than like the question of like whether, you know, because, you know, I think it's, if this sort of abstract model of feudalism could be applied to any society, be it, a European medieval society, I'm just using this term, for convenience, which is really its only purpose, or, an antique Greek society, or, the antebellum South, the United States. Like, if that were like truly a feudal system and that the concept of feudalism mapped onto that, then that to me like would justify like the term of feudalism, regardless of whether like there was a consciousness of this as feudalism at the time. Like, I think then it still could be justified as like a concept. But my question is, like, is it in fact true that when you're saying like, okay, well, capitalism must have emerged from feudalism because there's maybe a problem there, because then wouldn't feudalism have had to have collapsed or receded in order for capitalism to appear? But for instance, like in the antebellum South, the United States, that to me is almost as feudal, if we're going to be talking about this, it matches the idea of the feudal mode of production almost as well, if not better, than medieval European societies match it. But that was also certainly a capitalist society. So perhaps these are things that actually, rather than having this, as you were saying about teleology, rather than having this sequential quality, maybe this is something that, these features that Marx and Engels put in this kind of sequence, this progressive sequence, they actually are aspects of society that kind of coexist. And maybe we can say one is dominant over the other at various times or something like that. But perhaps like these elements are present in societies.
I think that's the dominance is what makes this important, right? Because in America, you never had slavery as the dominant mode of production, and also the synthesis of the collapse of that mode of production as dominant, the slave mode of production as dominant, and its collapse and synthesis with the colonial mode of production, which would create the feudal synthesis. That also never really happened in America, because in America you mainly had the of course there's also a problem for it to be feudal because it was very industrial throughout the 1800s in terms of its production of the means of production. The agricultural means of production were produced by heavy industry already, and I think the homestead cannot be translated as colonias, because the and again, like, now this is so confusing because we should come to this later, like when we've done this, when we've done like Greece and everything, because there's a lot of interesting things that existed in the world that the Romans occupied in the Germanic world, where there were different kinds of modes of production that had to synthesize or mix together with the collapsing modes of production of Rome, which created the feudal mode of production. But again,
maybe we can come back to the concept of feudalism.
Yeah, I think so, because
and we
I want to hear
instead talk about like the slave mode of production.
Because
I feel like that is kind of what is key in this.
But then, I think so, and that's this is exactly what happened, like in my mind, right? Like, and that's why I had to go back all the way here. And I think the first interesting thing then is that if to use the moralist term, like the Dark Ages, that capitalism is the light, right? Then we should also know that Greece also sort of the Greece that we know arose out of like a Middle Ages or a Dark Ages of its own after the Mycenaean collapse, like during the Bronze Age.
The Bronze Age collapse.
Where they already did have an alphabet, and they already had not a developed market, but there were markets obviously, but a more developed society than what would happen during the so-called Greek Dark Ages. And then out of this, a new sort of Greece, what is usually termed like archaic Greece, appears. So it had a collapse of its own that it needed to create a sort of like historical medium of non-specificity that like a kind of very specific then archaic Greece could arise out of, where you have, for example, the alphabet in the 8th century. And I think we have then like about 400 years of like a long interregnum where literacy disappeared and economic and political life regressed to a rudimentary household stage, right? And the primitive and the rural world is this, which is described in the Homeric epics, which they, to a certain degree, knew about. And then, this is later, this is in classical Greece, right, with the Homer, when they look back on what came before. But if we first go for the archaic Greece, before classical Greece.
Yeah, this is like 800 to 500 BC, right? Or BC?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And we see that there's something different happening in Greece than the other, or maybe not yet so different, but there is something that is going to make it different than in the other places where these Bronze Age civilizations disappeared, like in Anatolia, Cyprus, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, the Levant, and so on. And I'm just going to see here where I was jumping into this in the text. That I think already here we have like this notion of the collapse is, I think, an indication, right, of like that history isn't like this kind of linear age of empire progress, where each stage of history knows where it's going to develop. Like actually, it might even be the opposite. Like that it is the unconscious sort of lack of knowledge about its possibilities and impossibilities that makes sure that a certain period can collapse rather than reproduce itself in a sort of rotating door where nothing ever changes, which is kind of what the Bronze Age civilizations were caught in. I can't remember who is it. Neil Faulkner, who I also cited in this text. He's the one who introduces this idea of like that the histories of engine can get caught in a sort of rotating door where they sort of just reproduce their own conditions, but there is no like real change. And that is so insofar that what they know, they do what they know, but then something happens, right? Like that there's something that they don't know, which like sort of grows and becomes a sort of negation of its own process, and many times because of what maybe they wanted to develop in a certain direction, but they didn't know that they carried with them then the seed of negating their own system that they were trying to introduce. And this is what we have, I think, also in the beginning of archaic Greece as well. So we have sometime before the advent of like historical records, we know that to a certain degree that like local kingships were overthrown by these tribal aristocracies, and they started to found cities, or they developed already existing cities, and they became, they fell under the domination of these nobilities, and the social organization still pretty much like reflected that which had been during the tribal past, from which they had emerged. And so that is to say that nobody was a pure urbanite, like a wealthy aristocrat only because of his power within the city. Like they weren't, wealthy landlords, let's say, in an urban sense. They were like, this was land ownership on the countryside. And so the hierarchies in the cities mimicked or mirrored the hierarchies that existed in terms of like land ownership on the countryside. But they did live in the cities often, and had their the countryside where they had their fields, right, and their agricultural belongings. And having replaced this monarchistic rule then from before of these kingships, this new aristocratic rule in archaic Greece, from, like you said, Dimitri, like from about 800 to 500 BC, it also coincides with some other interesting developments, which can be maybe linked to their rule or just a sort of like historical accident, because sometimes they didn't invent these things.
Right.
So, for example, in long distance trade, right? It was mainly with Syria and the East, because they were already doing trade in the East to a much greater degree than they were doing on the Greek peninsula, and so they are, linked up with this, which makes it an even more long distance trade towards the West, right?
Right.
And then we also have the adumbration of coinage, right? Or the introduction of coins, which was invented in West Anatolia, in Lydia, in the 600s BC. And as mentioned already, like, the alphabet, right? Which is derived from the Phoenicians. Right. So none of these are like really their own inventions, but they can come to the fore, or they can mix in such a way because of this aristocratic rule that wasn't possible during the tribal rules of the monarchs, because of these cities and because of, as we will see soon, something about the slave mode of production that also makes this possible, which is their invention as a dominant. Like, I'll go through this in a short while. There was slavery before, but there's something that this archaic Greece, the aristocrats of archaic Greece, manages to do, which hadn't been really done before. So in this typical small town, right?
Sorry, do we want to open up like the question of, or do you just want to go through like this narrative and then we can like go, like, I was thinking, do we want to open up the question of like what an aristocrat is, like what does an aristocrat mean in this context, like that, might
I definitely
be,
did, because you found an interesting book, Khalid, that was from Aristocracy in Antiquity, redefining
like
Greek and Roman elites. It's a volume of different essays. I forget what year it's from. It's from the last decade or something, but I just read kind of like the introductory essay, and it makes them similar to what arguments people would make about.
Who's one of the editors, like a good writer on this stuff.
They talk about, similar to how some scholars would like contest kind of like the label of feudalism. This book is sort of trying to do something roughly similar in antiquity with the term aristocracy, and it brought up certain things that are like, for me, like, I'm, it's the fun thing about doing a podcast with somebody who has a PhD. I'm not always aware of these like intense like quarrels and over, interpretation, like among like, expert scholars and stuff. But they do make some interesting points that I kind of hadn't thought about before, as, somebody who likes to be critical of aristocracies in general throughout history, of like, well, wait, what kind of aristocracy existed? And should we use that term in antiquity and like also use it in 18th century England and 15th century France and all these other things? Because I think the Hans von Wies and Nick Fisher, their essay talks about like there's this presumption of like hereditary nobility that really comes from like the quote unquote medieval European kind of era, and it's like assumed, it's like it's like projected backwards into antiquity as, it must have been that way. And like, I never actually, it's like when I thought about it, I'm like, like I took Latin in high school. I was exposed to like, Roman history and shit like that. And I kind of like never thought about like, like maybe they didn't. And these academics make an interesting argument that the hereditary part was not nearly, maybe in some cases a limited factor of like there's a wealthy family and they have a couple generations that inherit some of that wealth, etc. But this idea of like a kind of hereditary based like nobility there isn't actually like a ton of evidence for that. And so they try to like disambiguate, well, what was like the dividing line between ruling class and like not ruling class, And it seems like they kind of settle more on, ironically, something that's much more analogous to today, where it's like the people that have the most money and are able to live without having to work themselves are like the elite. Like they're the ones that are at the top. And then oftentimes there's also a smaller subsection of that elite that is sort of the ruling class, like the active ruling class that actually like is involved in politics and managing society like actively, and it's a lot of complex stuff. But what do you think about that in general?
I just wanted to say I like their introduction because like part of it is like sort of what you say, like talking about the like this problem of like this imagination. Like this is the way in which I feel like it's in some ways all connected, because like whenever we're like, history is kind of it has a lot in common with storytelling, and like they even though like they didn't know, as you rightly say, like we do. So we're trying to like do historiography. Like it's almost inevitable that like we're thinking about these things in terms of our own time, and in terms of our understanding of what came before. And this is like part of the reason why he talks about this idea of the medieval model like influencing this idea of like a property class of landowners. That is also interesting, and he engages with the Communist Manifesto in that context. But for the sake of time, another thing that I found interesting about this was how he kind of I guess it's also Fisher who did this introduction. He also kind of like redeems in a way, because I remember back when I was like an undergrad, I was actually a classics major in undergrad, and I took this one class on like the Roman city or something was the title of it. And I remember like one of my classmates like saying something like, were those the upper classes or something to the professor? And the professor was like, we try to not use the term class, that's a Marxist term. We say orders, and like, like I remember that very clearly. It was like very strange, but that actually is kind of a thing where like there's a little bit of like a tutting that happens and I think like part of it is motivated by a real thing, which I think that like maybe is like a legitimate critique of Marxists, where there is like a little bit of this like effort to like force everything to fit into this like prescribed model from Marx and Engels. But like it's kind of like a reaction to that. But still, like I liked how these guys like kind of did like kind of go back to an idea like this. They kind of had a synthesized model where it did in some way have to do with this sort of idea of orders, or of like kind of like relationships, and like I'm not sure what the best way to put it is, but like not just hereditary, but like kind of like forms of leisure and like citizenship and things like that. But also like it had like a socioeconomic dimension. I'll try to find the part that's like most relevant. So like I
can spin off this just a little bit to the transition, because I think it's I mean it's not super stupid to talk about orders for the next transition that happens here. Because let's say if we try to define like any class should be defined by its relationship to the productive forces, right? And so I think why it's useful to talk about the aristocrats in the archaic period before antiquity has come to the real fore is, even though urbanization is developing and where you can start to see this order in the urban city, like of basically like a cultural segment of society that expresses its wealth in a different way, which is not experienced by the fact that they own a lot of land. They are not seen as farmers or people of the countryside. They are seen as people of the city, right? But what also starts to happen when these cities then come up and they start to find their place in this nexus of archaic Greece becoming antiquity, or like classical Greece, I think it's then we start to see that there is this kind of like nouveau riche class, which then isn't really like a class, because they kind of have the same relationship to the productive forces as the old aristocracy do. I think the only difference is then that they are newly rich, and they don't have this old aristocratic, both that like they haven't owned land for as long, and also they don't have the cultural appearance, I guess, of like being maybe traditional rulers.
Yeah,
and
this is the classic old money, new money kind of tension.
That
you see in many cultures.
It's kind of like basically like basically like a bourgeoisie sort of like is being kind of created. Like that's like I'm not sure. Like again, like it's kind of a misty period of history. It's kind of like Homeric times in a way. So it's like hard to say. Like, but I think like part of it is like, well, you know, was this bourgeoisie? But I think this like part of this is very relevant to what you're talking about. Let me read this. I think it's pretty good. Like you know, they write. An important but under-researched question is how stratified communities came into existence in the ancient world. This is basically exactly what we're talking about. The traditional assumption that aristocracies existed throughout the early Iron Age meant that the only question asked was how nobility managed to reduce the power of the king by the time the city-state emerged. This is basically exactly like where we are in this. Those who more recently argued for the existence of egalitarian or quote-unquote ranked societies prior to the rise of the polis have not gone very far in developing a model of how or when ranked chiefs became a quote-unquote aristocracy, or at any rate an upper class. The archaeological evidence for Greece before circa 800 BC suggests small-scale communities with only a few leading men, and accordingly it seems likely that the development of stratification, rather than the overthrow of an old elite, went hand in hand with the formation of the city-state. The growing number of burials, elaborate enough to be archaeologically visible in central Greece and Italy in the late 8th century. I'm thinking of Gerard right now. Obviously, those burials were just someone getting stoned. But anyway, sorry. You know, for example, it may in this light be interpreted as reflecting not the broadening of an existing elite, let alone more population growth, but the first emergence of stratified communities in the early Iron Age. For ancient societies which had reached this level, our question must be what kinds of social stratification existed and what concepts are more useful than aristocracy in analyzing social inequality. We have so far used upper class and lower class loosely as colloquial terms which avoid the misleading connotations of aristocracy and commoners, but these concepts are themselves quite vague, and we should consider the usefulness of class in the more technical economic sense, pioneered but sadly not defined by Karl Marx. That's one of those great academic lines. Among ancient historians, class has been notably defended by Geoffrey de St. Croix, and most recently by Peter Rose against Moses Finley, like who's also like a famous like feudalism theorist. His brusque rejection of the concept as quote not very sensible. The upshot of the Marxist argument for class as an analytical concept is that property is the single most important factor in the creation of social inequality, that inequalities in property create relations of exploitation, and that quote-unquote class struggle between exploiters and exploited is the single most important dynamic shaping historical developments. The main objection raised by Finley is that in the ancient world, distinctions of informal quote-unquote status or juridical quote-unquote order in practice outweighed objective common interests based on quote-unquote class position. By implication, status rivalry rather than class conflict dominated ancient history. And then, you know, this is what they say about that. It is unfortunate that the debate has been cast in such polarized terms that it seems more fruitful to give class and status equal billing, to analyze the relation between them, and to explore the conditions under which one rather than the other becomes dominant. This avoids the weakness of both approaches. Finley surely went too far in insisting that elite ideologies concerning the acquisition and use of wealth truly shaped elite behavior to the extent that economic position was always of secondary importance in social hierarchy. For example, he discussed the discussion of how Roman contempt for professional money lending meant that the likes of Brutus could only lend money as a furtive amateur sideline to their main career as men of politics and leisure, seems to miss spectacularly his own point that the Roman elite was nevertheless involved in money lending on a stupendous scale, and that this was not a matter of occasional abuse, but of something structural in society. Evidently, the ideology of status and this interested very little to inhibit Brutus and his peers from exploiting their class position to the hilt. On the other hand, a Marxist insistence that only class is an analytically useful category quickly runs into the problem that ancient history features conflicts between groups that do not apparently stand in economic opposition to one another. St. Croix's argument that there were several quote-unquote classes within each main quote-unquote class, he considered but rejected the label subclasses, is feeble, since on his own view there is no difference in economic interests, let alone a relation of exploitation between, for instance, the Roman senatorial and equestrian orders, which nevertheless clashed during the late Republic. You know, and he goes on to talk about like this is about Greece, so I'll read it. Both St. Croix and Rose take the conventional view the major social struggle in early Greece was between the aristocracy and the quote-unquote middle class of independent working farmers. Yet this is not easy to fit within the framework of a class struggle. It is in the nature of the latter's independence that they were property owners and that their labor was not exploited by the elite, so that in terms of class, the two social groups were on the same side of the divide. One might envisage a sort of preemptive class struggle with independent farmers fighting to prevent falling into dependency, but it is far from clear that this is what these scholars have in mind, let alone that this is what happened. It is preferable, therefore, to accept the validity in the principle of both quote-unquote class and quote-unquote status, and to analyze how and why each of these forms of stratification developed, and how they diverged or coincided in any given time or place. And he keeps going on. It's pretty interesting, and I recommend this. But yeah, I'm curious, like, what you think about that.
I think so. First off, you can have when they say status, right? So we can imagine that they are two different social formations fighting, even though they are part of the same class. So you can have class struggle even as an engine of history. I would say there are three big engines of history: technology, class struggle between classes, and class struggle within a certain class.
Totally.
So in this, right? And so in this case, you can see that there is some fighting going on here, even though they should somehow be allies, but they are not. And then, so why are they not allies then? Like if you were just saying class, you wouldn't get the answer, right? And so you can also, you can have war then. Let's say we're going to see it in not the next transition, but there's going to come an interesting sort of, you might have heard of them, the Macedonians, who are a little bit different than the Southern Greeks. Gets mentioned sometime in history.
Oh yeah, controversially so. Yeah, the degree to which they're separate. Yeah.
And now the first instance, though, I think that we can explain here. Let's say that we have both aristocrats and oligarchs. If we talk about this proto-bourgeoisie that you mentioned them, like as you said, it's kind of murky. We don't really know how they made their money. It seems to have been maybe I've tried to find out where the research is on this right now. There are a few interesting agricultural inventions, like oil cultures, for example, that would have given them an edge in the new global trade system, or not global, but this trade nexus that starts to arise around the classical period, when the archaic period ends, which maybe that is how, as kind of like a proto-bourgeoisie, like that they didn't even maybe own all the land if it belonged to the aristocrats, but that they somehow managed to connect the traditional inheritors of land with others, and they started to be able to pick and choose among the nobility who were, doing really good olive oil and who was doing shit olive oil, and kind of forcing this technological invention, which doesn't necessarily relate to the slave mode of production, because that is another problem that we will come to, that the slave mode of production couldn't cause this kinds of invention, but maybe this selection of producers on a more intercontinental scale could have done that.
Yeah, it sort of subjects them to a form, like these middlemen sort of open them up to being subjected to market forces, and which does kind of spur. I noticed. I watched some of the Cockshot. Was it Paul Cockshot, right? The British Marxist. And some of his video essays on YouTube. And, he makes that point about why the slave economy, units in the slave economy are very low innovation, because they rely on human capital to create their and they own all these use values, but they're not dealing in commodities and currency and stuff like that, and they'll only adopt technological labor saving devices or whatever if they as a last resort, if they absolutely have to. He makes the kind of disturbing point that the chief technological instrument to increase profits on a plantation was the whip.
Yeah.
You would set a quota, nasty. And if this and that happened in the antebellum South in the United States, and that happened in Rome. They had all these colorful little whips and stuff that you would use when your slaves did not pick their quota of crops or do the amount of work that you allotted to them. So generally, you don't see a lot of a pressure cooker innovation dynamics in slave economy, in the slave economy. But yet it does, certain things do develop in this period. And what about the development of iron? Because obviously that's, I think you mentioned in your write-up that might have given more small independent farmers an ability to build more durable tools and then pass them down to their children. And like, once the knowledge of, I don't know, cultivating iron, like it's spread.
Like iron as that kind of third engine, right? Technological engine of, I think really does something. And I don't know, this was, I don't know, remember when I read this part maybe 10 years ago, I thought it was like, it's such, I don't know, it's like really one of those moments where I felt like theory really opened up a new kind of way to understand history, because you have, I never really understood before why iron would come to replace bronze in this way. But when you look at it in this way, that it has some three pretty like unique qualities, right? That there is its ore is more abundant, which makes it cheaper as a raw product. And then not being an alloy, the second point, not being an alloy of like two different kinds of metals, there's it's relatively more easy to forge it. And the technology then also to master it becomes easier. Both the technology and the knowledge how to do it becomes easier to teach and to spread, right? And so again, it becomes more abundant and more cheap. And then the final thing is that once all this has been done, the abundance of the ore to make the tool, to make the iron, and the knowledge to make the iron, both of those are more abundant. And then it can remain more abundant because it's so much harder than bronze, that you can pass it down, like you can inherit it. And so it doesn't have like, it doesn't depend on the same velocity of reproduction, which is very necessary for these kind of like non-industrial periods of history, where things move slower, right? And I think they realized this. In Khalid's example, they were talking about the middle-sized farmers, right? But the middle-sized farmers, and I think this is the interesting thing, I don't know why if they mentioned it somewhere else, but at least what I think is interesting about this is that they do not rise up spontaneously to overthrow the aristocracy. What has to happen first, and this seems to be like, at least in the examples that I looked, there are a few exceptions, for example, Sparta, which we'll get to, and Corinth. But as a general trend, what happens around 650 to 510 BC is that we see that from this new nouveau riche, like this proto-bourgeoisie status people, like who are not of like the traditional aristocracy, they start to appear as tyrants in like city-state after city-state, and they. Some of them are like newer landowners. Some are these more mysterious upcoming merchants of this recent wealth, which we just speculated a little bit about, like how they might have, gained it. But what's
just
most
thinking of
important,
the tech billionaires and Epstein, like fitting into this historical.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too.
Yeah, they like kind of are, at least Fisher and Van Wees like kind of like reject like the idea of like a like the equivalent of like a bourgeoisie, like or like out of a broader middle class, like I mean like they like it's like not in the sense of that we have
I'm just being like a little bit cute class. Calling them
like a quasi it kind of resembles a like the same kind of role in society, like, and positionality like to the ruling class, like nouveau riche. Nouveau riche might be the safest thing to call them.
I think nouveau riche is the best one, because they don't really, they don't have this kind of access to industry, of course, that like the bourgeoisie has, and they don't, I think, have the same. I mean, in China, you actually do already have like kind of like, I mean, it's going to come later, but it's easier to talk about like a proto-bourgeoisie over there, where you have already sort of superstructural like cosmologies which are based on economy. I mean, even some suggest that like Buddhism started off in this way, that like Buddhism became acceptable around 400 by these new merchants, because they are the only ones who can sort of take that notion of like nothing has any inherent existence seriously, because they have seen that, oh, it costs so much over there, but it didn't cost anything over there. Interesting. Maybe things are empty. Like
like material possessions like have no actual content. Wow, interesting.
Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. But what happens here is that the tyrants who appear here out of this this nouveau riche pseudo class, then they start to to rally the small size farmers and the middle size farmers. And had it not been for iron, this wouldn't have it wouldn't have like maybe done much damage. But now you had all these people who could arm themselves and guard themselves. And also what they could do once, this was put into motion was that the people who joined in could start to realize that, it's actually not because of the class struggle within this upper class, which is the true necessity of history here. What is actually making this possible is iron. Like the technology as an engine is more dominant than the feuds between the newly rich and the old rich. And so
that actually makes sense. Yeah, because that's like I think that is like kind of a little bit like, it's interesting to like kind of compare this with the idea of like was it simply just like the amount of like humiliation that like eventually like piled on? But I guess those two things kind of go hand in hand.
And then suddenly you have an iron sword in your hand, and then possibilities open up that prior to that technology would not have been open. And but I think they make that in Aristocracy and Antiquity. They make that point of like we can't rule out that a lot of like upheavals and things like that are really kind of like a reaction to the depredations of like the ruling elites. And sometimes I think they even say, makes me think of kind of like right now about how the intra-elite fight sometimes can be like destructive to like the overall society and kind of blow, like basically negatively impact like the people lower down the food chain who are not directly like involved in that struggle, and which pisses them off at like the whole kind of ruling class. You can think about that in our kind of like a cowboy v Yankee kind of way, with our ruling class like fighting each other all the time, and yet they are in the same class. Like, so it's it's like you need something a little extra than just like bourgeoisie. Like, is there one team, they stick together, and then they fight the the working class. Like they do they beef internally, like sometimes fiercely, right? But anyways, sure. Sorry.
It opens up like the possibility of intervention then of the excluded. And we're going to see this happening time and time again. And also what you just suggested, that like, people lower down the food chain or the class hierarchy below the revolutionary class might actually be, might find their exploitation increased by the revolution. You see the same thing happening like in the 48, right? Like both anarchists and communists, declared 48 as a failure, whereas the nationalists and the liberals declare it as a victory, right? And if you look at, for example, like in 79, right, the Jews are given citizenship in France. In 1917, they're given legal equality in Russia. But in 1948, you instead have the first introduction of like, the conspiracy theories where they are both the capitalists and they are those who have like started the revolution. So they get like, pogrom from like both sides, like both by reactionaries and by revolutionaries. And in this case here, now we're going to see that what has, when these people who were toiling under the yoke of debt bondage, and they have sort of cut themselves away from this exploitation, they are going to intensify the slavery mode of production. I mean, the aristocrats we're going to see this with Sparta as well. We'll get there in a little bit, but the aristocrats hasn't perfected the slavery mode of production in the way that the Democrats are going to do it, which is another like really interesting turn of events here. First, that you need tyrants to impose democracy somehow. I mean, of course, the tyrants didn't intentionally do that, but in most of these cases, they set it into motion. And we see this from the accounts of Solon, right? Even though he was not personally a tyrant, he gives this account, which seems to have been like a general trend in many of the policies. And so, two interesting things: the Democrats come to power via a tyrant dictatorship, which is foreign to aristocracy, and they turn up the gear of slavery to 11 to maintain democracy. And so, yeah,
it's interesting. Like try to draw parallels to today. Many one could make, but interesting. Yeah. When the Sock-Dem revolution of the petty bourgeoisie takes over, they will increase slavery to pay for democracy, for the free buses.
I mean, imagine they only stop, ICE to throw out the sub-proletarians so that they can systematize better their sub-proletarian status. I mean, it is the smarter way to do it, to be honest, for the economy. It's costing a lot of money to throw away the cheapest labor. It costs money to throw them out, and you also lose the cheapest labor by throwing them out.
It was set up that way for decades for a reason. Like I think there was a bipartisan consensus that like this was economically beneficial to them. And so you could see that be like they're not going to extend like justice to like the lower classes. But rather exploit them in a more like efficient way. Yeah.
Especially if they want affordability, right? Affordability depends on somebody else working a little bit harder so that you can buy these things in the city.
Someone in the chat mentioned Hesiod. I read a super interesting essay about Hesiod while preparing for this. I'm not sure we're going to have time to talk about it, but like I didn't even, because I remember reading like Theogony like way back, like also in undergrad. And like I didn't realize that like it was unclear like what part of society Hesiod belonged to. I read an interesting article about like was Hesiod like a quote unquote peasant? Was he like a landowner? It was kind of anyway. But I would like to eventually maybe talk about that, but I don't know if we have time now.
Yeah, the chat says that Hesiod's poetry is always bemoaning how the quote great men are endlessly plundering from the virtuous small farmers. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting, but
where are we time-wise? Actually, how long have we been doing?
We're okay. We haven't. It's only 9:16 EST.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All right.
We still got it.
Should I read a little bit here, because the only moment of detail I think I have in this paper is the revolutionary sequence itself of the democratic experience, where things move quite fast and a lot of interesting things happen.
Yeah, go for it.
And then we can move over to try to, at least the way I try to explain a little bit what made the slave mode of production unique. And then we can, somebody's going to come from the north, who everybody knows by name. And
That's
then,
right.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Right. So, things moving fast here, right? Like the movement passes through like three distinct stages in Athens. First, this 30-year-old dictatorship, it wasn't 30-year-old everywhere, but in their case it had been, of a tyrant, was overthrown, and it was replaced by an intermediary, interim aristocratic government. Then second, attempts by conservative aristocrats to block reform provoked a popular uprising and installed the government of democrats. Then third, a Spartan military intervention in support of aristocratic counter-revolution was defeated by a second popular uprising. So they are sort of forged in war here. And this is going to be like a case, right? That also another thing about the Democrats is that they will be, for the rest of this period, almost in war. I think, 3 days out of 4 for the entirety of like this period, which means that democracy is not peaceful. There is like, so this democratic model ends the monopoly of the nobility and the tyrants, turning the citizen body of small and medium farmers into an armed militia, as well as a productive force with class consciousness, and it's implemented almost everywhere. In every city-state of Greece, except a few interesting exceptions, which I'll get to later. Now, a few things has to be said about this democracy before we go on. Greece was divided into 1,500 or more miniature polities, each competing for land, resources, and mercantile advantage. So democracy united citizens within each city, only to turn them into a military force against other cities. Democracy was the political expression of a specific citizen body, not that of a universal social class. Athens, for example, the premier city-state democracy, was at war, as I said, 3 years out of every 4 during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. And as I think everybody knows, at least this, liberals even likes to admit this, that women, foreigners, and slaves had no political rights. Only adult male citizens could vote. But a majority of the latter, they were working people, and the power they wielded was very real. So I think I said somewhere here that, like, if you don't believe in the democracy of this democracy, you can just look at, like, how these like the ones that we know, like from history, right? The Socrates, Plato, Aristoteles, Isocrates, Xenophon, and so on, like how they related to this new movement. They were like staunch believers in oligarchy, right? And they like continuously argue against them. And like, why would they have done that unless they felt threatened by them?
I think that works in days definitely like, reflects that, like a property to elite that's like excluded from power, kind of, or something. Yeah, it's interesting how ambiguous it is, but yeah, you kind of see that. Anyway, sorry, continue.
They are forced to pay taxes, whereas the regular citizens don't have to pay taxes. Everybody is involved in deciding like who they're going to go to war with. At least, if you're going to have war all the time, it would be nice if those who fights get to choose whether they're going to do it or not. So like justice was administered by a jury court of up to 2,500 ordinary citizens. So it's not only the political state apparatus which they siege. They siege, the justice, the judicial state apparatus as well. And I think, like, I just added this. Of course, you can go on in much more detail about this, but I think like what we really lack is like ostracism. I think, like, which they had, which was election in reverse, where anyone who secured 6,000 negative votes was expelled from the city for 10 years. I think that's a like.
We could use that. I think, yeah.
Right. I think it makes it. I don't like this sort of, like the agora should be like a. I don't know what there's some. These neo-Gramscians that use the term, like what the Chantal Mouffe loves to use. I don't like her so much, but something about like she's trying to combine the word for class struggle with debate, and she's using some kind of word for antagonism. I think ostracization as a political tool does. I mean, it's more civil than killing the person, obviously. So, but it does still suggest, a negative relationship to the rulers. Whereas in a representative democracy, it's always a positive relationship to it. Like, oh, this is what the people want. Yes, but also listen to what the people don't want, man.
Yeah,
like,
it's always very
negation.
yes and, very UCBS form of democracy. Yeah.
Right? So,
Wow, this is the original cancel culture in a way. At least within a democratic framework. This is they were kind of doing cancel culture, but like I kind of, I could see it. Maybe you do need a little bit of that.
Yeah, like struggle sessions, like a cultural revolution.
Exactly.
Style.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it all sounds. I think we have like maybe already discovered the key why this can't live on. Like insofar that it wasn't a universal social class that became democratic, but it was democratic policies, city-states. Sort of pushed against each other in a world where only 15% of the land is available to agriculture for cultivation. I mean, this is going to increase the levels of antagonisms, which is maybe already why Greece is such an exemplary case. Is that everything is like catalyzed. All these class contradictions, all these engines of history are like running on such high gear because there's so little agricultural land. I think it's my agricultural fundamentalism, at least. Like I think it plays a big part in this, and we're gonna see.
So now we're like in like the classical Athens, like we're in like 400 BC, like right? Is okay. Just making just clarifying because they're all
and now we can take like a little like non-history bound like per decade or century, but we can look at like maybe like how is the slave mode of production different from other modes of production, you know, like from peasant modes of production, for example.
Well, one thing I really want to bring up here is like we were talking before about like Perry Anderson, and I wanted to talk about like Ellen Wood, like not only her book, I forget, like Free Peasant and Slave, but also like, you know, she wrote like a short essay basically that like kind of like goes in on Perry Anderson. It's like Marxism in Ancient Greece, I think it's called. And like she like really critiques 80s, right? Like the use of this concept of the slave mode of production to like talk about archaic Greece. Yeah, I put it in the document. I'm like wondering, you know, like how or if you would like defend the idea of the slave mode of production from what she says, because to me, like it seems like she kind of lays out like it's a pretty hard to like argue with case basically. To me, like I see like basically like, you know, I'll read like a short excerpt from it that I think is like pretty representative. Like you know, it's not in particular about Anderson in this part, but she says the essential problem in traditional Marxist view of ancient Greece and of classical antiquity generally is not so much that it attaches excessive importance to slavery, but that it fails to take sufficient account of free labor and its role in shaping society. The concept of a, quote, slave mode of production is itself a blunt instrument which can do justice neither to free labor nor to slavery, nor to the complex interaction between the two. Furthermore, it tends to distort the analysis of class relations to the extent that it implies a clear social division of labor between citizens, or free men generally, and slaves, and glosses over class oppositions between the citizen body. Finally, all this acts as an obstacle to the interpretation of the cultural and ideological products of Athenian society. For example, Marxists have consistently treated Greek anti-democrats, who we were just talking about, like Plato and Aristotle, as spokesmen for the citizen community as a whole, or as reflections of the slave mode of production. Instead of stressing their role in expressing antagonisms, I don't think this is a problem for what you're saying. I think you're saying very much the same thing. You know, stressing their role in expressing antagonisms within that community between the leisured few and the laboring many. Thus, the aristocratic contempt expressed by these philosophers for banausic citizens, a word you don't see very often, but, you know, people engaged in manual labor, banausic citizens, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right, and for the excessively high status accorded to free laborers by the democracy is taken to represent nothing more than a general degradation of labor by slave production. In all these respects, the legacy of anti-democratic historians, who for reasons of their own obscured the position of free labor in Athenian society, has left its mark. More recent Marxist scholarship has had to come to terms in various ways with the historical evidence concerning the role of free producers, but there has often been a great reluctance to abandon the basic framework of the original analysis and its fundamental premise that the essential class division was between citizens and slaves. I guess what's not in that is, you know, the like the historical evidence of like that she talks about, you know, in her book, that, you know, of the sort of like role of like free labor in ancient Athens, which, you know, you told me that you like knew for Ellen Wood, so I assume you're like familiar with what
because she's also Marxist, so
she was like you know, like one of these like little branches of like she was a critic of like, I guess, critical like the using Marxism just like as a historical analysis that doesn't like have it's interesting because like in a way like the whole thing was about like kind of making sure that it has like a political, like Marxist historiography has like a political end, but like, you know, in a way like it's you know, in this area she was like kind of a champion of like historical like rigor over, you know, like kind of the ideological element. But I guess, you know, part of the ideology is that like, you know, you should not you know, favor like the model over like the, you know, the evidence, I guess. So
it's one of those paradoxes of Marxism is that like if you're really adhering to like that rubric, you wouldn't kind of just like embrace it in like a polemical, you know, like pedagogical, you know, deterministic like sense. Like you wouldn't treat it the way people treat other ideologies, because it's supposed to be a ruthlessly critical thing of itself, and like, you know, the truth like a mechanism of truth discovery, you know.
And as you just said, Marcus, like, you know, the majority of the population like is, you know, this like you know, like kind of like they weren't necessarily wealthy leisured proprietors, but they were also not slaves. which kind of creates problems for the traditional idea of like the slave mode. So that's like something
but I
interesting
think
to like open up. Yeah.
during the democratic period, I think at least in Athens, you will see that the slaves outnumber the free citizens, right? I think I can't remember how to what degree, but I think what's important here, like from Ellen Wood's like perspective, is that just because a certain mode of production is dominant doesn't mean that there aren't other modes of production. And even like when you think then that collapses are what prepares history or like what makes sure that history moves in a certain direction is to collapse, then like you can see that some modes of production have started to develop already under the dominance of another, and as soon as this kind of like central domination of that mode of production disappears, they can suddenly start to express themselves fully. Like, for example, you have, middle-sized farmers using the water wheel, I think already during the Roman time. But it never becomes something that can really move agricultural technology forward because slavery still sets the standard for how production is done. So it's like, and the pace, it sets the pace for it. But there are like cases where like, slavery is more productive than free labor, and there are cases where free labor is more productive than slavery. So dominance doesn't mean that one is more productive than the other. It's also another thing to remember. But I have the quote, right, which I think is, which is why, like, since Ellen is also a Marxist, it's like Marx has this nice quote, which is really difficult to understand, which I think it's like one can return to time again to sort of makes one's case. And I think one should do that, especially like she does. Like the best thing, if you're a Marxist, is to criticize other Marxists. Like that should be like a sort of like
it is the best thing.
The tradition.
It is the tradition.
Yeah. And so Marx writes in this cryptic way, right? I'll just read the quote. And this is from Grundrisse. In all forms of society, it is a determinate production, and it is a determinate production and its relations which assign every other production and its relations their rank and influence. It is a general illumination in which all other colors are plunged, and which modifies their specific tonalities. It is a special ether which defines the specific gravity of everything found within it. End of quote. So which means that like also the superstructure has to relate to labor as something associated with slaves, which makes it very dirty, which makes it look like, that is something that is, shit. You shouldn't labor. I think they don't even have, Per Anderson says that they don't even have a real word for labor in Greek during this time.
Yeah.
I mean, what about like ergon?
How would you translate that?
Work, effort.
Yeah.
Like, like how they say now chairs are ergonomic. They like, are work supportive.
Uh-huh. But that's also more related to the instrumental aspect of it, right? Like almost like.
Well, I guess they wouldn't have like a. I mean, I guess
level.
Insofar as like labor, I guess like it might have the connotations that it has for like modern socialists, but I mean
we're gonna see. For example, if you look at the I just explained why I said instrumental, because ergonomic is interesting. Because in Rome, where we have like the really judicial fundaments for like slave ownership in ways that like not even the Greeks could perfect, you see them defining these subclasses of all the laboring categories of whether they are animals, tools, or slaves, are all instruments. Instrumentum mutum for the lowest, like the actual tools. Instrumentum semi mutum for the animals, and then instrumentum verbales or something for the slaves.
You're talking about Latin. This is Rome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is my home cook. I don't speak Latin, but like this is how my home cooked Latin, something like this. They refer to it as.
I mean,
what was the breakdown of the population in, like, say, Athens, if you know off the top of your head, of like sort of quote unquote elite, like landowning elites, and then like free citizens who labored, and then slaves? Because you said slaves were like the majority of the population.
Yeah. I don't know the different parts. I know it's going to go from about 50,000 to 80,000 now. From I think during the classical period, that is sort of the development. I think like by the fall, when the Hellenistic capitals are in the east rather than in Greece, you're going to see that like it's about 80,000, I think, in Athens. But I
80,000 slaves, like, or total population?
No. Overall, like people living in, and most of the slaves, I guess, they were used on the countryside, right?
Okay.
Even though like artisans could have like up to 2 slaves, like even like a poor artisan.
I mean, I do think that working, like, you know, like workers were the majority of the free population. Like there may have been more slaves. I'm not sure. Like I don't know the numbers either.
No, I think they definitely are the majority of like the citizen population, probably. But then what percentage is the citizen population for like?
Yeah,
like
I don't know either.
How much of the population is slaves?
And in fact, I imagine it's not easy to like actually determine. But I read some, like, I mean, again, like, it's hard to recall, like, from my reading, because, like, it did span, because, like, your essay spans a very long period of time, so it's, like, some of it is about archaic Greece, and some of it is about classical Greece, which we're now talking about, which are kind of different, and, like, the dynamics of, like, the sort of class dynamics and the economic dynamics, like, do change a lot, as we were just talking about. So, I'm not sure. Like, I do recall, like, reading one thing about how, like, you kind of have to infer from, like, who's talked about the most in, like, the literature, and, like, slaves definitely are talked about more. But there are, like, a lot of references to, like, hired laborers, from pretty early on, like the thetes, right? That's what they're called. I'm not actually sure what that means independently of the like the term for the group of people. Like the thetes, the lowest social class of citizens nation, is the Wiktionary definition. The thetes, theis, or hired laborer. The translation is getting like serf, bondsman. And I guess that
I found one estimate here in the one of the books that I used, not the Perry Anderson's book, but Neil Faulkner's. He says that Athens, the largest and richest, contain only about 30,000 adult male citizens. The total population, including women, children, foreigners, and slaves, was probably around 200,000. So then we don't get really like exactly how many, but like in terms of demos versus non-demos, you have 30,000 30,000 demos.
Yeah.
200,000 non-demos.
So really, we're talking about maybe 12, like, rough estimates here, but like maybe 10 to 15% of the population are citizens, and then a smaller slice of those citizens are truly wealthy and probably like constitute a more influential, to some degree, elite than the poor free citizens that, were like the ones that don't work for themselves are definitely a minority of the maybe 10 to 15% of the population. So I don't know. This is this isn't the most rigorous thing, but just shooting from the hip, I feel like you could definitely make an argument that this is like a slave economy. Like, I mean, that's like that. Like, it might be different if you're talking about like a smaller percentage of the population is like kind of kept as slaves, but then there's like more independent producers. I do feel like the qualitative. The quantitative amount, like, kind of, it ends up being the dominant mode of production. I mean, do you want to read the next part of the paper here?
I don't know. Call.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
I can just say what I think that, like, what I find most interesting about Ellen's critique is that it might have been, it might have been like the production, like I said, for example, with the water wheel during Rome, I can't remember if she goes into Rome either, but you're like, like what is going to be useful for the period that comes after the period where slavery was the dominant mode of production isn't slavery, obviously. Like that's going to be something else, which already there were like capsules of that during antiquity, which is going to be become the dominant mode of production during the feudal mode of production. And so I think like I think if you think that antiquity was if one thinks that a slave economy is all about slavery, even though it influences all other aspects, one forgets that like the seeds for the collapse and what the subsequent era is going to be built upon was already produced during this time.
Right. That's a very important.
Dominant.
That's a very important point. Yeah. So it's like these things, these modes do like often coexist, and one arises during the dominant era of the other, and like so. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a totally valid point to point out that it wasn't like a total slave. It was just like elites and slaves.
Yeah,
like basically,
I think
like
part of it. Yeah, and I think part of it that's interesting to me is like, is this the primary like distinction in like in society? I mean, again, like I'm not sure like about the slave numbers, and I guess it's something that we should like have known like going into this conversation. However, like leaving that aside, like like part of what's interesting about it to me is like the question of like for instance, like she writes, let me see if I can find the relevant part. But
you can also already the statistics that we said, right, with 30,000 adult male citizens and 200,000 people who are women, children, foreigners, and slaves. I guess like if you look at it also then like culturally, since they don't think of them as citizens, they are unfree subjects of the state somehow, right? Like they are not all slaves. Foreigners, children, and women aren't per definition slaves, but they are also not free individuals, right? The woman belongs to the husband, and the children belongs to the patriarchal home, and the foreigners sort of are there on lease, right?
That's true. Yeah, like it's not like 85% of the population is slaves. There's people that don't have political voting rights that are also
that's definitely 100%. Like women is like really what you're like, that like okay. I didn't realize that. No, definitely wasn't. Yeah, just that 15%, and then the rest is slaves.
Yeah. Now that I think about it, because you'd have to like
but still, I think
it to
we
include
definitely
the
are
families
talking
of the
about
people.
A slave society. But I think that a slave society and a slave mode of production, like, are kind of are a little bit like different. At least like as some of these like historians are talking about them. Like I think that a big part of her point is like that slaves were engaged in all sorts of like different occupations, and that there wasn't a like real division of labor between like some of these citizens and slaves. I think that that's like where
they often did the same types of work.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think but I think that it kind of does have to do a little bit with what you were just talking about. Like I guess let me see if I can find production for the market remained underdeveloped, and individual craft production remained the rule among slaves as well as free workers. Even in the few quote-unquote workshops where many slaves owned by a single master worked under one roof, the division and integration of labor appears to have been minimal. In agriculture, where slave labor was less important, possibly even negligible, the rule was small production. I don't know if that's still believed, but properties were small. Even wealthy landowners usually owned several separated small holdings, and there were no slave gangs of the type that worked the later Roman latifundia. I remember those. Most land was apparently worked by independent peasant proprietors, tenant farmers, and to some extent hired, usually casual laborers. That's another thing, is that there was a whole phenomenon of foreign laborers that were hired too. That was another like kind of category of labor, where people who weren't like citizens and weren't slaves but were foreigners. I forget what the term for them was.
Gastarbeiters, as they call it in Yugoslavia.
But yeah,
like still in Sweden.
Yeah, the typical productive unit, agricultural and quote-unquote industrial, was the individual who produced and sold his wares. Thus, if slaves and citizens were not clearly opposed as a class of non-producing appropriators and a class of direct producers, neither did they compete as two clearly distinct forms of labor with different degrees of productivity. I mean, that's one of those things where, like, I can kind of, like, then I think what we were talking about before comes into play, where it's like, well, perhaps not, but, like, even if at the class level or in terms of their relationship to like, you know, labor or their modes of production, like, they, you know, that distinction might not have been, like, primary from, like, this perspective. Like, I don't think you can ignore the distinction between slave and free in ancient Athens.
Kind of a big deal for your life. Yeah, like whether you're on one side.
Definitely, like, I would never deny this is absolutely a slave society, as was ancient Rome throughout. You know, and as was, you know, like Abbasid Baghdad, and, you know, maybe not to quite the same extent, you know, you know, these different types of slavery that you see throughout, but it plays a big role. You know, like this, you know, it's a definitive aspect of society that's always constantly coming up and is often on people's minds, you know, like in all the ancient Roman comedies and all, like, the Menandrian comedies too, you always see the tricky slave. It's like the iconic character, you know, so, like, they're always, like, slaves are a big part of, like, their consciousness, and a big part of their lives. So, like, there's no question we're talking about a slave society. But I guess the question, like, in terms of analyzing this on the, like, a sort of a materialist level, like, where we're talking about, like transition socially, I feel like that element of the mode of production is like, you know, of, like, the concept of slave mode of production is important. But, you know, I don't know if we have to, like, if we can't move on from whatever comes.
I think the next section of the paper, if you want to read it, Marcus, might be good, because it kind of takes us from here a little more info about like the modes of production into, like, the early trade and all that other stuff. Yeah, you want to read that? From, like, the classical world was massively unalterably rural. It's on page 7.
Page 7. Oh, okay. So I think, like, page 7. Yes, like after the quote that Marx did, right? Yeah,
right.
I'm going to start to introduce something here also that I think even Ellen didn't answer this in her critique of Perry Anderson, and I think this is, like, a kind of original thing that I did, was that, so why is it, like, of course you just expressed, like, you know, how we see their cultural relationship to the slaves. But it was, of course, that is just a symptom of them living in this society. It wasn't that they had a different cultural relationship to slaves, and that's why they adopted them to a dominant degree, rather than, let's say, in Baghdad or in Ptolemaic Egypt later. Like these places also had slaves, but they didn't become dominant modes of production over there. That was not a determination by the superstructure against the economic base. Like, I wanted to show here, I think the next segment was like that there is something different in the way that agriculture is done, which only allows for dominance of slaves in Greece, but it doesn't do it in old Egypt, it doesn't do it in old Mesopotamia. And that's a kind of like I think the final point to this, and I'll get to that. And I can start to read here from the after Marx's quote that the classical world was massively, unalterably rural in its basic quantitative proportions. Agriculture represented throughout its history the absolutely dominant domain of production, invariably furnishing the main fortunes of the cities themselves. The Greco-Roman towns were never predominantly communities of manufacturers, traders, or craftsmen. They were in origin and principle urban congeries of landowners. Every municipal order, from democratic Athens to oligarchic Sparta or senatorial Rome, was essentially dominated by agrarian proprietors. Their income derived from cereal, oil, and wine, the three great staples of the ancient world, produced on estates and farms outside the perimeter of the physical city itself. Furthermore, these three great staples, once they left the farms, were not only the mute objects of accumulation and consumption. Through trade, they carried within them the pre-capitalist force of the commodity, which began linking the antique world together. But it could only proceed by water. Marine transport was the sole viable means of commodity exchange over medium or long distances. The colossal importance of the sea for trade can be judged from the simple fact that it was cheaper in the epoch of Diocletian, and this is the emperor who initiated the process of the Roman Empire split, right? 284 until his abdication in 305. And he's from the eastern part, ne? He's not the West Roman.
Yeah, as I recall. I only remember, it was easy to remember because his name was Diocletian. It's like split it in half, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Nominative determinism.
True.
To ship wheat from Syria to Spain. Right, so it's cheaper. It's cheaper to ship wheat from Syria to Spain on one end of the Mediterranean to the other than to cart it 75 miles or 120 kilometers over land.
Wow.
I mean, this is
that's pretty wild.
Fuck. The first time I heard that. Yeah.
Right.
It is thus no accident that the Aegean zone, a labyrinth of islands, harbors, and promontories, should have been the first home of the city-state. That Athens, its greatest example, should have founded its commercial fortunes on shipping. That when Greek colonization spread to the Near East in the Hellenistic epoch, the port of Alexandria should have become the major city of Egypt, first maritime capital in its history, and that eventually Rome, in its turn, upstream on the Tiber, should have become a coastal metropolis. Water was the irreplaceable medium of communication and trade, which rendered possible urban growth of a concentration and sophistication far in advance of the rural interior behind it. The sea was the conductor of the improbable radiance of antiquity. The specific combination of town and country that defined the classical world was in the last resort only operational because of the lake at the center of it. The unique position of classical antiquity within universal history cannot be separated from this physical privilege. In short, the Mediterranean provided the necessary geographical setting for ancient civilization. But again, its historical content and novelty, however, lay in the social foundation of the relationship between town and country within it. The slave mode of production was the decisive invention of the Greco-Roman world, which provided the ultimate basis both for its accomplishments and its eclipse. The originality of this mode of production must be underlined. Slavery itself had existed in various forms throughout Near Eastern antiquity, as it was later to do elsewhere in Asia, but it had always been one judicially impure condition, frequently taking the form of debt bondage or penal labor, among other mixed types of servitude, forming merely a very low category in an amorphous continuum of dependence and unfreedom that stretched well up the social scale above it. Most importantly, it was never the predominant type of surplus extraction in these pre-Hellenic monarchies. It was a residual phenomena that existed on the edges of the main rural workforce. The Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and Egyptian empires, riverine states built on intensive, irrigated agriculture that contrasted with the light, dry soil farming of the latter Mediterranean world, were not slave economies, and their legal systems lacked any sharply separate conception of chattel property. So it is not that a certain pharaoh or a Babylonian king looked upon slavery in a different moral way than, let's say, a democratic hoplite in Athens or a senator of imperial Rome. Rather, something in the way that the agricultural economic base and the need for slaves had been organized since time immemorial was different. And here, now I get into my point about, and I was thinking maybe I should show you this. I have a cool little a little picture, because I'm gonna maybe talk about something that's very difficult now, but which I like so much, which makes it maybe more difficult. Let me see here, where I have this photo of where you can see all the different evolutions of different kinds of agriculture, and you're gonna see like how the quote-unquote Near East and Egypt shares a common origin together with Greece. They branch off in two distinct different like forms of agriculture, and I'm just gonna see if I can find it here. But maybe while I find it now, you can comment upon what I just said, or
this is like a wrinkle in Perry Anderson, and I admit, like, I'm not sure if I read like anything more recent on this topic, but at least Perry Anderson and Ellen Wood uses to critique him. He says that slaves were outnumbered by free labor, specifically in agriculture. So I feel like that is and again, I don't know if that is true. So I don't know if that is I'm actually looking now to see if I can find more recent work on any new evidence dealing with in this actual period of the classical period of around 400 BC, what slave presence in agriculture was. Because in terms of Perry Anderson, that does seem to be a little bit of a wrinkle, in the relationship of the slave mode to the agricultural base.
Was there a sizable increase in the relative, in the amount of agricultural labor overall once you get into these peak centuries here, 500, 400 BC than there was prior to that, where maybe there were more free laborers and slavery was a little more marginal, but then it ramped up in the sort of democratic era. I'm not sure, but
this is from 2017 by Keith Hopkins. I don't know anything about him, and it is about it's classical antiquity. Research into slavery in the classical world has become all the more piquant because chattel slavery flourished in the city-state of Athens, and it is Athens which has been lauded as a prototype of democracy, just as what we're talking about. This paradox has plagued the apologists, as it should, but the common prejudice in favor of liberty denies that the slave has misled historians and sociologists into treating slavery as though it were an isolated method of exploitation. That's kind of interesting. Slavery as a sociological subject can best be considered in relation to other forms of dependent labor rather than in terms of our own ideologies. Slavery is not only a species of the genus dependent labor, but wherever it has been found, it has always coexisted with other forms of dependent labor, such as apprenticeship, indenture, concubinage, bondage, debt bondage, sharecropping, money, and or labor tenancy, and wage labor. Therefore, we can fairly ask, why and in what circumstances does slavery flourish rather than or in addition to these other forms of dependent labor? Good question. I feel like that's kind of similar to what we're talking about now. He says, we must also set slavery in the general context of the exploitation of independent labor. At most periods and in most areas of the classical world, it is probable that self-employed or, quote, free workers predominated, especially in agriculture. It is again probable that about 90% of the labor force was employed in agriculture. Athens was an exception since it served as the entrepot for a much larger productive area. The proportion of her population directly engaged in agriculture may have been only 75% in the 5th or 4th centuries BC. As in most pre-industrial societies, the peasantry was very largely self-sufficient. But while they did not consume much, which was not produced by themselves, they did produce crops which they did not themselves consume. What is significant for slavery is the size of this quote surplus and the ways in which it was extracted from the peasants, for example, by market exchange, clients' gifts to patrons, rent and taxation. Increases in the efficiency and extent of exploitation through tenancy, taxation, this is all very interesting, and bureaucratic corruption laid open new avenues to private wealth, alternative to and to some extent superseding direct exploitation to slavery. Slavery ceased to be a major method of procuring wealth, while it long survived as a method of displaying it. That is interesting in light of what von Weiss and Fischer say about how they kind of use Veblen's term, actually, of the leisure class as an alternative to the term aristocracy. That what really defined this class was that they were kind of displaying leisure, and this, but was their ability to kind of engage in this kind of conspicuous consumption. But anyway, so I guess... it's it's not clear, I guess he is saying that at least, this guy is saying that free labor did outnumber slaves in agriculture in Athens, but Athens was unique in that it wasn't as agricultural as most societies in antiquity. It was, there were only 75% employed in the agricultural sector.
That's still pretty dominant.
Yeah, I mean, totally. Yeah. But it's kind of, it's just funny. It's rather than 90%, it was
right.
Yeah.
I think the difference though, the major difference of the two agricultural modes of production here, it's not maybe modes of production. It's more like which agricultural revolution do they belong to? They are still different and very distinct regardless of whether the labor is free or slavery works there. And I think one is much more compatible with slavery, and the other one is actually somewhat incompatible with slavery. Or like you could make it, but due to like the social formation that built up around it in Mesopotamia and Egypt, it wasn't as necessary. It didn't become a historical necessity in the way that it developed into Rome. But I can go through it here, this part, and then after that we will get to like coins and money, right?
Oh, right.
So, and did you see here? I don't know if we can post this in the chat somehow. Maybe we can't, right?
The photo?
We can maybe share.
I flashed it a second ago, but I can bring it back up.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
It's very complicated, but it's from like my favorite. It's like
this
a
is kind of interesting. Who is this?
1,000-page long book about agriculture by two French Marxists, which I referenced almost like this is my go-to like explanation for everything. Like, okay, now I know why there was a change. Right. So I will make reference to it soon, right? But I just start reading here. Like as most people know, the move away from like solely depending on hunting, fishing, gathering, and what sometimes in my show I call natural farming, towards proto-cultivation and proto-animal raising, which would later become agriculture proper, began in the story of our geographical context in West Asia, about 10,000 to 8,000 BC, right? Though it was long believed to be, this was not unique. There are many other global centers of origin of the Neolithic agricultural revolution. It is no longer even necessarily the first, since evidence is arising which suggests domestication of taro in the New Guinean center, Papua New Guinea and New Guinean center, that might predate many of the famous cereals that would come to feed the Sumerians. This is also the case for certain trees in the Amazons and the South American center, and perhaps even peppers and avocados in the Central American center, bushes and shrubs and dwarf trees. Three examples of distinct centers. These are, right, what I just said, New Guinea, the Central American one, and the Amazonian one isn't actually even a center, usually considered, but yeah, like more and more data is coming forward here, like in the last 20 years, that makes this a lot more complicated. But it seems like still, I think today, that the West Asiatic center of origin was relatively more intensive, and people and cultures of this area quickly like walked into a dependence that caused both probably the first over-urbanization and some of the first famines as the Egyptian and Sumerian civilization began establishing themselves. Now, I don't want to go into like how agriculture came about too much, but that's usually what I talk about. But here, like the point is that both the Greco-Roman world and the Egyptian and the Sumerian, they get like their agriculture are both descendant from a kind of like slash and burn farming, which is what you see there on this picture, that like predates their first approaches to like agriculture. Like probably all agriculture somehow, at least historically, whether there is a lineage or not, but like it seems like that there might have been. I talked about this in my early communism and the ocean series, that there are some like really interesting research teams finding evidence for like slash and burn farming or slash and burn landscape cultivation, let's say, in Africa, almost like 100,000 years ago.
Right.
And yeah, which is like really crazy because it seems like that is actually what might have even made cereals start adopting to dispersers like humans and animals, which like created the sort of the cereals that we know today that are like with big seeds and stuff, and because they wanted to attract like humans as their dispersers. So it's not that humans, domesticated the cereals. The cereals domesticated us by like picking us as as their dispersers.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. And I think here, like what happened in the Greco-Roman world, which didn't happen in Egypt and Sumer, is this, or the other way around. I mean, what happened in Egypt and Sumer, which couldn't happen in the Greco-Roman world, was that this evolutionary line of agrarian systems based primarily on winter cultivation, using basins and the receding floodwaters, as well as the system of irrigated cultivation at different seasons. So like this is their specific like mode of agriculture, which the Greco-Roman world couldn't imitate. Like it, to a certain degree it could, but above all else, it was the Greco-Roman agricultural revolution in antiquity was based on an agrarian system based, sorry, I'm saying based a lot, but based on fallowing and animal-drawn cultivation with the yard in temperate regions. So like fallowing is when you leave the land without cultivating it, right? To sort of have it naturally recover some of its nutrients, which isn't actually, there is indication that maybe in Egypt they even planted clover in between, something that the Greco-Romans didn't know how to do. It again seems like I'm not sure like how it might have even been that like the Egyptians forgot how to do that, but that's a really interesting thing, like that they planted cover crops like clover to boost the nitrogen of their fields, which might have been like why it was, you know, the breadbasket of all these of so many civilizations around the Mediterranean for like thousands of years, right? That there were like these kind of, they maybe didn't knew at one point why they were doing what they were doing, but then they sort of forgot also some things like why they were doing what they were doing, and then some things might have fallen away. But you can see at least that in the case of the Egyptian Nile and the Mesopotamian Euphrates and Tigris, right? You have the necessity then of like a much more centralized state, which sort of like controls this hydraulic agrarian system, which is much more automatic, but also insofar that it isn't automatic, demands a lot of like labor of like organizing, of like building the like checking on the basins that they aren't clogged, and irrigating when you have like actual irrigation, when you have to build canals, you need to set aside certain periods of the agricultural calendar where everybody works on creating and maintaining the canals. And also, of course, we see that like a lot of like the religion, like insofar that there are no canals and just ebb and flow, a lot of their culture and religion and judicial superstructures develop in accordance with that, like the ebb and flow of life, basically. I think like I've seen some suggestion that like some of the first priests, like that the hieroglyphs that they used were initially used to like measure the level of the Nile, right? In these like kind of reverse wells that didn't feel like, or like they are wells, but they were wells that like you could see like even though you weren't standing next to the Nile, you could see the level of the Nile, right, by the level of the water in their well, and interpreting this was like maybe kind of like the original tea leaf reading of like interpreting where at a certain time the well water was at a certain time of the year, and that this gave them like immense like prophesizing power. But we can see like in the other case, which is less automatic, it can also be more decentralized. Like that's where you can have different police states, city-states in Greece, without like a center in Memphis or like a center in like in Babylon or in Ur, or like one of like these like overarching state apparatuses. But then you also like with decentralization, you also open up then the possibility much more of this kind of each middle-sized farmer being in need of his own personal slaves. we're also going to see that in Sparta it was actually like owned by the state, but again, simply because there wasn't like the same hydraulic system like of agriculture, but this temperate animal drawn cultivation with the ard that also introduced which also depended on fallowing. Now I think those, like, there's much more details that one can like go through, like about these different agricultural revolutions, but that's, I think, even if like all labor was free, this would still be a difference that would like mark the historical progress for like these civilizations in different ways. I think is my major message here, which maybe is a critique of both like Ellen Wood and Perry Anderson. I don't know, like if I should be a Marxist, I should say that it is like that they should take this in consideration, like the natural economic base maybe, or whatever.
Right. Now you say a little further down here, what's the problem with slavery? After comparing both these agricultural systems, you say slave labor was not in general less productive than free. Indeed, in some fields it was more so. But in the places where it became dominant, it set the pace of both, so that no great divergence ever developed between the two in a common economic space that excluded the application of culture to technique for inventions.
Right.
You say that's a rather nice formula. The application of culture to technique for inventions. Yeah. Could you break that? Could you break that down a little bit?
I think we touched upon it like before, but like that there is this. Like when you have like an entire culture which views production as some kind of like quite dirty, and the activity of like unfree men, like I can see if I'll take some quotes here, like Aristotle says, quote, "The best state will not make a manual worker a citizen, for the bulk of manual labor today is slave or foreign. Such a state, the best state, represented the ideal norm." Oh, sorry, that's or foreign. End of his quote, right? And I think if I added Plato's quote too.
He said he implicitly barred artisans from the polis altogether. For him, quote, "Labor remains alien to any human value, and in certain respects seems even to be the antithesis of what is essential to man."
Right.
Okay,
right.
Bro. Like, why do people... I'm sorry. It's like a dumb thing to say, but like, why does everybody stand these guys? Like these like pedos who like these like elitist pedos who are like people who work suck. Like, what the, like, okay, anyways.
What's the deal with that?
Yeah. What is the deal with that? Like, why are they stand so fucking hard? Like, everybody, even like LaRouche is like, oh, Plato, like he's the greatest person ever lived. But I mean, you know, serious people too are so wedded to these like guys, and it's like, yeah, they had some good. It's like the Heidegger thing on like
really
steroids.
A very interesting question. I mean, well, it's because like our entire like epistemology like is based on like their, you know, like the Western canon, like, and that is like the like most fundamental element of it. And really, like, I mean, that's a whole question in itself, is like, how did that like come about? Like, why is it that like for whatever reason people decided that like this, you know, was going to be like the bedrock of like this whole like epistemic matrix, like that everything is relative to like, you know, 5th century BC Athens.
And I think
like,
this
epistemic... we like studied like playwriting or like, you know, screenwriting and playwriting.
We had to study Aristotle.
And, like, we had to study Aristotle. Yeah.
The poetics.
But, like, like if you really think about it like that, it doesn't really have anything to do with anything other than like his like philosophical like axis to grind. You know, like, and it's not really relevant to like what is like the most effective thing, and like it's like a totally foreign like social context. Doesn't make like, you know, like the way we.
It's like his angry Substack post, like how to make a great movie, like, you know, how I would make a great movie.
It's like reading a Substack post from like and like from a totally different society and a totally different context. But yeah, it is an interesting question of like how, because it's really and now it's like it's globalized where like everyone like reveres like these guys, and everything is like relative to that, like, and I think it's just part of it is like that it takes a lot of work to like, you know, get away from it, I guess, or like to like go out and find something else, you know. I appreciated, Marcus, that like you mentioned at the beginning of the essay, like this I think it was was it a Japanese writer? It was like a Zen monk or something, right? Who I'd never heard of because I don't know very much about that at all. And like that type of thing, like, you know, how much of that is like accessible, like in translation, you know, like that's good or like recent, and like is it a critical addition, you know, and like makes it parsable, you know, and or is like familiar to people, like that type of thing, you know. People don't even like bother to seek out, and a lot of the time, like, even if that is in translation and does have like a critical edition, it's like the tip of the iceberg. But anyway, sorry, I digress from our point.
But I think your point about like epistemical knowledge is the problem here, because it relates only to objects. It doesn't relate to processes. And if you only think that like productivity is an accumulation of objects, you are a hoarder. You can't even become a capitalist, right? Like, if you really want to be a capitalist, you have to know that the commodity never rests. Like, you have to see process over hoarding. You have to see the process over, like, the capital is not a hoard. It's not an object. It's like, it's something that is continuously being something else.
Right.
And this process, if this process is in the hands of like unfree labor, they are not going to, you know, nothing is going to happen with it. It's going to be like as reproductive as reproduction can be. It's not going to find like forward movement for like improvement. Experimentation cannot take place, and experimentation always takes place in the productive process. And like that's like down on the factory floor is like where, you know, you see the limitations of your method. And
I mean, maybe this is just a segue and I shouldn't like open it up, but like, what do you could you clarify what you mean in terms of like how like objects like in like the epistemological area versus like objects in the, because I understand what you're talking about in terms of I do see kind of what you're getting at in terms of the slave, but explain the slave labor being kind of like objective in that way, but you know,
So like the slave is an object, right? It's not a subject engaged with a process. If a free laborer is the subject and it wants to observe something, it will observe the process, how it is it might observe the object as well. You know, oh, look how much shit I have, for sure. But it will also observe the process, and it will try to, you know, perfect the process through experimentation to maybe get more objects, we might assume, or maybe just because it has, you know, the subject has a love or an unalienated relationship to the process.
Yeah.
But if all productivity, or like if much of the productivity is carried out, like, you know, by subjects who aren't treated as subjects, but rather as objects, it's going to become like a static outlook, right?
That makes sense on like a psychological level. Like that you actually, I think you sum this up, if I can read you right here at the end of this section. I feel like you sum this argument pretty well, that once manual labor became deeply associated with loss of liberty, there was no free social rationale for invention. The stifling effects of slavery on technique were not a simple function of the low average productivity of slave labor itself, or even of the volume of its use. They subtly affected all forms of labor. Rome inherited this class system and this general attitude, and that will force us to return to this contradiction, the lacking inertia of technological productive inventions when we get there. But yeah, that idea of like the stifling effects of slavery on technique, it kind of intuitively makes sense that, you know, slavery, like slaves are disincentivized from like innovating in the same way that free producers generally would be. And on top of that, even the sort of negging that a lot of these serious thinkers do from the kind of the ruling class in this era, like Plato, saying that, you know, people who work like are kind of not human. Like they're like actually like people who labor. It's weird. It's almost like a Marxist point from like a very different perspective of like you're not a human because you labor, and that alienates you from your humanity. So therefore, like, but in his case, he's like, we should ban people like that from like voting. which I don't think was like what Marx was going for with that. But it's like the best state will not make a manual worker a citizen. So when you grow up when you're living and operating and working in like a social environment like that, it does put like a little bit of a damper on, like, it's not cool in a way to be like a worker. Whereas, you could say in later, more like fully capitalist mode of production societies like the United States, being an innovator and an inventor or whatever was like elevated to an extremely high status, and to the point where people do to today like want to be an inventor of something like revolutionary. And the society is set up like just ambiently across all kinds of sectors to like incentivize and encourage you to do that, even though, of course, it's kind of a rigged game where only a small percentage of the population is ever going to like, make a lot of money off inventing something. But, people have commented on that in, American society. Like Wang Huning talked about it, about how like Americans love being like little tinkerers and like inventors, and like because there's this incentive structure just ambiently in our entire culture that's like constantly reinforced. So you could think if like the opposite of that is happening, then might have a dampening effect, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
but I think also
I can see how that makes sense. I mean, I think it is an interesting point that I think Wood makes, that we shouldn't necessarily take what Plato and Aristotle and Xenophon make what they say, even though like, again, like this is like the thing where like those things are preserved and like passed down to us, like and like there's so much that is lost, like that we don't have access to. Like we shouldn't necessarily, because those guys are like all literally like, it's kind of like if our society was wiped out and all we had was like Josh Cinderella's like show, like, because it's all just one group of friends, like it's all just one group of friends. Like, so it's not
That's so
like
true. That's so true.
Like
anybody who's been published in the New York Times as a cool new thing, like basically that's like our entirety of our civilization.
It's not
even
like...
in terms of sheer numbers, like that's not even true. Mr. Beast is way bigger. But if they ever nuked all the data centers, then we'd be left with these print editions of Jacobin and New York Times profiles.
My point is that like, well, it's just like one group of like tight-knit friends that have like very particular concerns, and like they aren't necessarily reflective of how labor was seen like in general necessarily. Not to say that like the devaluing of labor like by slavery doesn't make sense. We're
only getting like these very elitist and relatively speaking kind of in a lot of ways like reactionary kind of leisure class people. Like their work is they're the only primary sources we get. Like anybody below them, any of the, like, not to mention any of the women, or anybody of like even the lower citizen class is not really, if it's represented at all, it's mediated through the takes of like the Plato stack, article where he's telling you like his take on like what these people are like and who should do what, and like dictating, his own preferences of like, morality and whatever. So, we're kind of stumbling in a dark alley when we look at primary sources from this era. I mean, it's really, there's a problem that plagued history up until like, relatively present, to like kind of the 19th, 20th century.
I'm sure there are some, but like the majority like is lost, and certainly it's always going to be. Usually it is like representative of like an elite stratum. Like probably a lot of people like are illiterate, like don't like really have the resources to even like express like these ideas. But and I guess it does kind of raise a question of like where innovation like kind of like originates. Like does it originate? I guess it's kind of
Althusser makes a really nice point about this when he talks about like the only materialist philosopher, right? Like, or the only like famous one, like Epicurus. Like, why so much of his is lost? Then you also see the like that relatively more is lost by him than Aristotle and Plato, for example, because the subsequent ruling classes also favored them more than they favored like Epicurus. Like they didn't want materialism. They wanted the idealism that could fit it, like with Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or like those famous like Catholic theologians who tried to incorporate what the Islamic world had kept, right? But even like we seem to have lost like relatively, like how to say, they seem to have targeted, according to Althusser, like Epicurus. Like we're often faced with this kind of alternative history narrative that like the Hermetic tradition has been, hidden from us, like by the church, and it's like, no, man, like nothing really like contradicting in what their idealism says. Like it has always been there, like as a sort of like third, leg. But like materialism, like when can you point at a certain period in like European history where like that has been the dominant ideology?
Before the 20th century.
Like what your definition of materialism is, I guess. Like, I mean, I would certainly say that. Yeah, I mean, I guess it really depends what your definition of materialism is. If you're talking about like historical, like Marxism, I guess, or you're talking about like, holding up like the thought of Karl Marx as. But I guess you're not talking about that, because that would be impossible. Yeah, you're talking about like belief in like well, I guess it depends how you define materialism. Certainly, like now I would say like insofar
now today, like a vulgar materialism is dominant today for sure. But like that kind of I think current of materialism that like Althusser identifies, that starts with Epicurus. I think he also had Spinoza, but I mean that's
Epicurus is kind of sus too, though. I'm not like a big Epicurus fan.
No, Epicurus is, in fact, course, like all of the old ones are.
The Stoics like are sus. I'm sorry, like they're
the Stoics are the worst, I think.
Yeah,
but Epicurus wasn't a Stoic, was he?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking about Epictetus. Epicurus is a little bit sus, but Epictetus is the one who I was really thinking of as being sus. You're right. Like Lucretius is also kind of similar like that. He's kind of like has like a kind of materialism. Like
burning of Alexandria, false flag, on purpose. Let it happen on a lie hop, my hop, maybe. We lost so much.
Yeah, I think even like it being founded as a like quote unquote museum is just like it depends on a lot of looting at the same time, right? Like from all the other libraries that must have existed.
I mean, it was blamed on Muslims for like many years when obviously that didn't happen. But I mean, well, like Muslims, I mean, on the whole, like it's funny that like in the kind of Western historiography, like the role that Muslims have is basically to be like a medium, like for like these guys like Plato and Aristotle, especially, but like really like in the Muslim world, like that stuff was, even though it is true, like people like Ibn Sina like remained popular, like that was like there's kind of this I don't want to fall into the trap of like the sort of philosopher versus Kalam distinction, which is like kind of overblown and like kind of suggests that like this kind of like bullshit thing where it's like, oh, the Muslim world turned away from science and philosophy when that didn't even really happen, and also like who the fuck cares, like because it's sus. But but like if it's partially true that like like people like Al-Ghazali and Ibn al-Arabi had like in certain domains, maybe not in the rational sciences, which like were not abandoned and still existed, but in areas like ethics and tasawwuf and all these things, like those thinkers like were revered. So I guess I'm kind of splitting the difference here between rejecting one Orientalist stereotype and saying that it's based to reject Aristotle and Plato and Socrates.
But maybe we should move on to.
Okay, let's keep going.
Maybe we should move on to like the Sparta.
By the way,
factor
I wanted to mention. I don't know. Did you read this article by what we see? Michael H. Jameson, Agriculture and Slavery in Classical Athens?
I didn't get to read it.
No, I only found it just now, so I know that. Yeah. I was asking
before we
Marcus
go
if you
on,
happen
can
to
I?
read this.
I have to
It's
go
kind
to
of
the
interesting.
toilet.
Anyway, yeah, no, I just wanted to mention it.
Oh yeah. We could take the break for a second. I'll run off too. And we'll be.
And I get a beer. It's time.
There you go. Yeah, I don't know what time is it there. Yeah, it's nighttime here.
It's 12:30 here, but toilet first.
All right, we'll be RB.
I'll interact with the chat while they're gone. Lots of posts from Griffin here. I always appreciate your presence, Griffin. You're one of our real stalwarts in the chat. Let me see here. You better off studying Aristophanes, Sophocles. I mean, I think that we did study Sophocles. Honestly, like, my thing is that something that really annoyed me was that we read Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone as like a trilogy. And that's actually not a trilogy that was presented like as such. The only real Greek trilogy that we have is the Oresteia. So, like, that actually was presented like at the Dionysia as like a real, like, you know, full trilogy, like in sequence. Like, the Oedipus cycle, quote unquote, the Oedipus trilogy that you're often taught like in high school or like, you know, someone's in undergrad, like, that is not really a true trilogy. They're in kind of a sequence, but they're not really like designed as a unit in the way that the Oresteia is. So I think that the Oresteia is what should be taught. And it's dope. It's much better than Oedipus Tyrannus. And the only reason why we had to like learn Oedipus Tyrannus is because of Aristotle saying it was the perfect tragedy, which it's not. Like, whatever. Let me go through the rest of these comments here. Unfortunately, that's the only one that I have a real fiery response to. Let's see here. Okay. The main advantage of iron is just the abundance of ore. I don't think it was such a crazy improvement. It took a lot of work to figure out. I really don't know, honestly. I don't know anything about metallurgy. I really should. I only know that iron is a resource in Civ, and it's, you know, important to have in Civ. So I'm looking up iron versus bronze utility. The person that comes up is like Ask Historians on Reddit. This is like the level of that I'm operating on. So I'll take your word for it, Kefala, that the main advantage of iron is just the abundance of ore.
The abundance of ore, yeah.
And the copper supply was more concentrated in places like Cyprus, which had geopolitical consequences. All right. Cockshot is cool as long as you never look into his views on social issues. What are they? And
yikes.
I didn't even like clock that name when you said it.
We talked about Cockshot before. He wasn't one of the California ideology guys, was he?
I don't know.
I don't know if I'm mixing him up with somebody else.
This is a little bit sus. He advocates for a system of a moneyless economy based on a computerized planned economy.
I think he was.
I mean, I guess that's fine.
I think he might be the.
Anything with a computer susses me out these days, but that doesn't sound like it's so bad.
Cockshot is from England.
Scotland. Yeah, and I believe he advise Allende on Cyprus in a little bit in the early 70s, and then had to flee. You know, when the coup happened. I forget if that's him.
I like his idea with computerized planned economy. I think it's interesting when he goes through like early Soviet computer power.
Right.
Like how after the Stalinist period they couldn't. There wasn't enough watts to neutralize the conflict with the petty bourgeoisie and like commodity production, like, you know, beyond the heavy industry. Mm-hmm. They only had computer power to effectively plan heavy industry. You know, so like consumer society couldn't be planned with the amount of like computers that the Soviets ever had, control over. Or like he even goes down to like watts, which is interesting. I was thinking I'm going to add that more for like the Roman time. Like, I agree with what somebody said there in the comment. I heard you mention it. Like, you know, his like he's a bit like conservative about or he has this kind of I don't actually think he often. I think he just comes across like quite. I've had like backs and forth with him, but like often he tries to be so orthodox in his Marxism that he's like, the standard. Like anybody who's been politically organized, where there are like old foxes in a party, will always be like, oh, let's not focus on that. Like, let's go back and read Plekhanov. And
right.
they're not like the most up to date on things, which makes their views kind of like not so nuanced and unattractive, I think, to people who are for gay rights or trans rights or even like different religions. Like he has some issues there for sure. I think also that one thing about like ore is not from him or the importance of iron. It's from Neil Faulkner, who is used to be a Trotskyist, so he's a little bit like there's some issues with him as well. But his chapter in People's History of the World, his big Marxist world history book, I think that chapter really convinced me about like what he's had to say about iron, which is interesting. I tried to bring up like a little bit of it here, but I can't remember if there was anything else from the chat. I was wearing my headphones when I was going away.
Okay, cool.
What you were talking about, Khalid.
Yeah.
Oh, we were like, I was talking shit about certain Greek tragedies and like iron versus copper, things like that. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe we'd talk about how Sparta differed from Athens, and then maybe the Peloponnesian War, and then the Macedonian intervention. Maybe to kind of, and I guess like currencies involved, coinage is involved in that, right?
Yeah. You should do this expediently.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry for.
How much do we have left? So I know
maybe about half hour.
Let's get going. Okay. Let's get going. Yeah. Let's.
Okay. So like I can, if we start to see then the velocity and the circulation of coins being more and more important, we can see then also that the market should become more and more important. As a last point about like why slavery couldn't do what needed to be done to improve agriculture in these places where it was dominant, which was different also than in America, because in America you do see a lot of inventions, like you two just mentioned, like that they even heralded like the inventors a lot, both for like transport and agricultural means of production.
Right.
Whereas here it's like, why would you introduce like a water wheel if slaves are cheaper? Like why would you cut down on like labor with a machine that is more expensive than just buying more slaves? I think it's like one of the these sort of base tenets for the inertia. Now, does this also play like a role in like why then the Greek democracy falls? Yes, it does, I think, but also, and I got like something from like a Bolshevik revolutionary and a historian, Ilya Grigorievich Ehrenburg. So I guess he must have been like an at one point expat German family living in Russia, I would imagine, maybe some generations later. But he was talking about like how, because the state couldn't develop very well under democracy, it couldn't have like sort of interdemocratic, like the relationship between different city-states, democratic city-states couldn't really, organize themselves. And we already mentioned this, like how they were always warring with each other.
Right.
Marx and Engels did talk about like that at the same time, this kind of like structural refusal, like this almost anarchist tendency was also like it was also one of the great perks, like why the democracy could last for as long as it did, because new tyrants couldn't arise in the same way out of it. Like they always, like, of course, these philosophers that we mentioned, and the other like oligarchs could always employ professional politicians, and they did that, but that was always like fought back as well by like the very statelessness of this like democracy, that it couldn't become as much of a political careerism as it would have if it had a more developed state. I think are those two main points provided by Marx and Engels, and also this Bolshevik revolutionary much later. I hear you had one of your comments when I wrote there that this meant that also no imperial bureaucratic class could ever develop. So even though when they did create federations and had their colonialization project, they couldn't, and I think I don't know, I couldn't read what you were writing about here. I didn't have the time because I saw it this morning, but I think this has to be viewed relative to what is going to happen during the Hellenistic period, that this imperial bureaucratic class that they were able to actually produce couldn't really be produced during this democratic period. But it could be produced by their enemies. So that you had an anti-democratic league led by Sparta, which could treat each other as equals. One democratic city-state can't treat the other democratic city-state as an equal if they need the other one to become their slaves, right? Whereas for Sparta and these other oligarchical city-states, they could for a brief period of time gang up together in this anti-democratic project, this counter-revolutionary project. And that is how we arrived kind of at the Peloponnesian War. And then I added here, because we haven't talked about it at all, how was it then that Sparta was different from Athens? And I think in general, what I've seen is that the lines of division between the oligarchical city-states and the democratic city-states correlate somewhat with, or fairly closely, with the maritime versus mainland orientation, where the democratic ones are more maritime and the oligarchical zones are more mainland. So for example, Athens and the Ionian zone of influence was a maritime nexus of islands and coastal cities, while most of Sparta's allies in the Peloponnese and Boeotia, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Boeotia, were more it's the northeastern one, isn't it? If my geography is...
That'd be like Salonika or Thessaloniki, kind of that area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were more narrowly rooted in the soil. And then there is the exception of Corinth, which is the traditional commercial rival of Athens, which occupied a geographical land passage between the oligarchy and the democracy. If you know that Athens goes out on a little small peninsula, right?
Yeah.
Though Athens isn't on the it's a little bit further in by the river, right? And then
it's on the coast, so it's not an island.
Yeah. And in between, if you were to move from Athens to Sparta or from Sparta to Athens, you have to go through Corinth, right? And Sparta, during the pre-classical epoch, in the days of the monarchs, during the archaic periods, before the aristocrats have taken over those tribal kings, and after that, when they started to do it, the 17th century onwards, had in a way already invented then Greek slavery by making so-called helots out of their surrounding western, southern, and eastern coastal neighbors. So on the Spartan peninsula, or what is it called, Laconia, right? Laconia. They took them over and made them into unfree rural workers, which became the life substance on top of which the first hoplite franchises were built. And according to semi-legend, after the conquering and the crushing of subsequent rebellions, the land was divided up into equal portions, which was distributed to the Spartans as kleroi, or allotments, tilled by helots. So they all get a little special, a reserved plot for themselves, and state-owned helots, which are sort of semi-slaves, working on their specific allotments. So each and every one has an allotment, but at the same time the helots are owned collectively by the state, and that's how they sort of the Spartan fraternity was created. And again, according to semi-legend, so I don't know like if we know exactly how it happened. But it also meant, that they could become then full-time soldiers and just work on training and partying and whatever it is that full-time soldiers do.
Yeah.
And because and because they were like unalienable rights, these allotments, which all like kept sort of like their social formation intact for a very long period of time, so that they never like appeared like a tyrant in the same way that it did in these other places, because nobody could have their Cleroy taken away from them. And they define themselves as like hoi homoioi, which meant like the equals.
The sames.
Yeah. So there was an equality. There was sort of like a ruling elite, like a ruling military elite who were, they were equals. They were first in society, but equals amongst each other.
Exactly.
And they had a sort of right that would to certain land and slaves that was like inviolable. Yeah. And they defeated Athens in 404 BC, right?
Yes, like that's the first end of the Peloponnesian War, right? And then there's one after when Thebes is Sparta is defeated by Thebes, ne?
Right.
Yeah, and I think like what's also important here, like going back to this with the slavery mode of production, is to know that another difference was that because they were owned by the Spartan state, they couldn't become, commodities, like real objects, like they could in the democratic states, where slaves could be sold and
interesting.
Used on the market, which is another thing that meant that nobody could have like a fuckload of slaves, so that these nouveau riche classes couldn't also not develop because of that. Of course, there was inequality as well in the Spartan society. I mean, it wasn't completely like perfect.
Yeah.
Like
I remember,
have it.
remember the movie 300?
Oh yeah, how could I forget?
Where he's like, he has to like battle the wolf, right? Like to like prove he's like a man or whatever.
Leonidas.
When he's young, right?
In reality, it was like a helot that was like chained up and like couldn't do anything, and you would just like murder him.
Basically, it's like Epstein Island, like what Sparta is like Epstein Island, the society, with BAP doing the aesthetics, like. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, they throw baby girls over into a big pit, right? That was in the movie, I think. It was freaking epic.
No, then he throws down the messenger, the Arab.
He kicks him and goes,
It was a Persian. Don't say that to an Arab.
It was Xerxes.
It's okay for me because half my family is like born in Arab countries and the other half is born in like Persian countries. Like they are Swedish.
Well, I mean, I'm joking. I mean, obviously, I don't actually have a dog in the fight between Persians and Arabs. I think it's all bullshit.
But then, But then we had this situation at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars. We have this situation bubbling up in Macedonia. I guess we should talk about that. The kind of grand finale of all this.
Yes.
Starting with King Philip II. And do you want to break that? I guess Philip was born in 382 BC in Macedonia. And Macedonia at that time made up the backward rural north of Greece. You said that it because of its backwardness, it had never made the slave mode of production dominant. Furthermore, it was the region least affected by a constant geographical agrarian deadlock, which rendered about 85% of Greece unsuitable for cultivation. It was a tribal monarchy based on many of those social relations which had ruled the other polises during the, quote, Dark Age after the Mycenaean collapse. Its monarchy was hereditary, but not absolute, for each king had to be accepted by an assembly of the realm's distinguished warrior. And then you say, I didn't know about this history. These olden ways also meant that it had many free tenant peasants and very little urbanization. Furthermore, when Philip was accepted by the warriors to become king, they first went north, not south, and overtook the great Balkan gold mines, which had belonged to the Thracians. This neutralized the internal revolts of his makeshift state of feudal landowners and tribal chieftains, but only as long as wars of loot continued, which could reward loyalty and service. So they get their hands on a lot of gold in like their early conquests, right? And then what is that kind of
but not
lead
only
to?
gold? I think what makes it extra interesting, and I found, and it's not just one person, but there is an interesting theory that like even though coins were invented in Lydia, why was it not so readily adopted east? That would have made more sense. Like in terms of Lydia, it has to cross the water and then into Greece. But it's not readily developed in the east, but it is in Greece, and it seems to have had something to do with that it was invented to pay mercenaries, and so it became like not like it wasn't a trader's like a means of exchange for the market, but rather a way to reproduce, for example, the Spartan mood, like where everything seems to be based on war. And also here, in the case of Philip, like his early kind of like proto-Roman methodology here of like, neutralizing internal conflicts by, making them mercenaries rather than slaves and paying them. Like that's how their colonization seems to have worked in the beginning. And then he does, what nobody else had been able to do, either Athens, Corinth, or Sparta, or, Rhodos, or any of like the big city-states that, like, he unifies Greece by the sword, right? By making them mercenaries who can be paid in gold coins. And then first thing they do is move into areas where this isn't as available, or like where it's not circulating yet to the same degree. And so they conquer their own markets, and then and here I think I started to add a little bit of like Graeber's theories about like coins in general. So like it's the first non-Marxist thinker, I guess. But he does have a lot of like interesting things to say about this. But like, it's not Philip that like, conquers. Obviously, like this is when we have first, once Greece has been conquered by Philip or unified by the sword, then his son take over, right? And this is Alexander.
Alexander the Great. That's right.
Yeah, or Alexander the Macedonian.
I guess you would say
or,
that too. It really depends who you ask. But known for
conquering most of the Greek known world, I guess.
I mean, actually, it's kind of crazy given that their formation was like these different city-states were constantly at war with each other, and then just this guy shows up. And they go on a generational run and, get all the way to Kabul, to Afghanistan and India, and then after he dies, then it's like not that long after he dies that then the ascendant Roman Empire kind of just like jacks their whole project and like takes over like the territories that they conquered, and but
it would take a while to get to
a couple hundred
honestly
years,
he's a lot more like Genghis Khan, like kind of, or that's
right.
what he reminds me of the most, like someone who like is just like a total like so like singular, and once like he was gone, like the thing like couldn't possibly like really hold together. But
I think the difference with Genghis Khan is like that Genghis Khan's economic base is it's not even like agricultural, right? Like they're much more into like husbandry. I think there's even like, this case, isn't it, where millions of Chinese peasants are just killed because it's like, well, this is now land for my horses. Like, what the fuck am I gonna do with your potatoes or like yams? I don't know if they had yam or potato.
It's definitely different in that respect. The nomadic.
Yeah, the nomadic.
Golden horde.
But I guess Alexander kind of brings, I don't know. I mean, he's
kind of Preussian in a way. Like he democratizes, I think, the army that like before. I think that the in the way that the cavalry was set up was, I mean, it was still mainly, the cavalry was mainly made up of like the aristocrats, but that didn't mean that they could sort of like do as they wished on the battlefield. Like they had to be like strategically incorporated with the infantry, which in their turn they let go of like some of their heavy armor so that they could be more mobile and compatible with the cavalry. And then of course like there's the introduction of those long spears, right? That creates this kind of iconic phalanx.
Yeah, the phalanx. Yeah.
Well, the phalanx pre-existed that.
I think they adopted it and like optimized it. I think, and like combined it with, and then that was the free peasantry, I guess, who were usually the operators of the phalanx, and then like there were aristocratic revenues of Macedonian lords formed a feudal type heavy cavalry, and the hill tribes on the frontiers of the kingdom supplied light infantry. So you combined, Yeah, you said the royal state combined the traditional martial qualities of its human raw material with the methods and principles of Greek warfare. The result was a coin-salaried military machine of unprecedented power. Yeah.
I thought that was my way of putting it there, like with the coin-salaried, like it becomes like, you can actually,
he's the first cryptocurrency. He's the first cryptocurrency warlord in a way. It's like he develops a shit coin that used to pay mercenaries to like overthrow governments.
And everywhere they go, they sort of force the conditions of the conquered territory to adopt to this by like melting down like these old Persian hordes that has just been like sort of not means of exchange but like hordes. So he's doing this kind of like proto-capitalist stuff by introducing a lot of new like bureaucrats, military soldiers that are going to like protect the new city-states that are going to pop up in the Hellenistic world where trade takes place, and this whole network of like trade. And then like, all the old wealth, as it were, like that was in precious metals is like melted down and made into things that can be used on the market. That is coins. And like, of course, the soldiers are allowed to take part in this as well, like, because they can go and steal things and take for themselves what they want.
Right.
And then also like, in a way, it's also like a redistribution within the occupied territories by taking the hordes and introducing it as coins to the general public, who starts to become, users of coins and tradesmen and like. And I think one really important thing is that like many people think that everybody then became slaves, where like Alexander's warriors like went forward, but like as we have already seen, their economic base didn't depend on slaves, like because it was this hydraulic, either manual labor constructed canals or the ebb and flow of like the basins and the overflowing and regressing of the rivers, like which were like annual natural phenomenons. So they could like kind of keep it intact. But what happens is that like these kind of new city-states, like copies of the Greek system, starts to be introduced, where like a new kind of administrative class and military and above all else, I guess the coins can start to be used. And the thing is, that this has sort of happened in India and China also, like during their warring states periods. So now you have like this kind of like new world that didn't exist during the Bronze Age, where like the Hellenist world can become like ad hoc connect to what then is what we know as like the Silk Road.
The Silk Road.
The
Eurasian, commerce trail, basically can be activated now that everyone's like trading in just a currency. Like, you point out that people were doing trade networks and trading between cultures for like a long time. The Phoenicians certainly were like experts at it, but they would actually trade on like, contracts and like, what was it, like ingots or something they would use to kind of like represent currency, but they would like sign like contract deals, and then that would be like they didn't bother with minting coins of any kind. But you could see how that opens up like the sphere of economic activity. Like probably only like a wealthy shipper or a merchant could like sign a contract and have it be honored or taken seriously. But anybody that's got like a fistful of coins, suddenly you can convert that into something that actually does, grant you status or a productive whether, land is still the primary productive asset to like own in the society, like land for cultivating. And whether you have free people that you pay with coins working on it, or you buy slaves with coins, like, it's sort of the thing that makes all this like further economic activity and connection like possible. Yeah, it's it's
really interesting the development, I think. And then we see that at the heart of like at least the Hellenistic Empire, you have these three big city-states, new ones like Rhodes, Antioch, and Alexandria. So after Alexander dies, right, like you have four major regions, right? Like, so you have the old Greek region, then you have like the Ptolemy's Egypt, right? And then you have Antioch in Attalids, which is like the West Anatolia, like on the above, like on the other side of the Greek waters there. And then you have like Seleucia of the Seleucidian Empire, or Seleucidian Empire, which is, mainly like the old Mesopotamia, like the land of the two rivers, right? All the way into like Persia, almost at the edge of India. No? And you mentioned Kabul, right? Like in Afghanistan. Like that's probably the biggest one. And that's the one that I think also starts developing more city-states, where it's like Ptolemy's Egypt, they are kind of keeping their centralization. Like Alexandria is really like the one big state, city-state. But also what you see here, I think another thing then, like with these two different agricultural revolutions, I mean, you had Athens, 80,000 people living inside Athens. Now you get like fucking cities with 500,000 people, sometimes like 600,000, I think, in if it is in Antioch or in Seleucia. Like it's crazy, like it's that agricultural economic base is like, once they've take over the city-state model, it just like, it goes to a whole nother level, like on how many people you can have living in an urban environment, being fed by the countryside, when the countryside is like, fueled by the Nile and the Euphrates. Like it's so much more productive than the slaves.
Is that figure of 80,000 like the Acropolis, like the city proper, like, or
I think so, yeah.
The whole region of Attica, like?
No, it wouldn't be the whole region of Attica, because then you have also the mines where you have loads of people. I think you have even single mines with more people than that, living in barracks and stuff.
Right.
Wow. Yeah.
But like it's a whole new game. Like and Greece becomes like the backwaters of their own state. Like it's the Ptolemy's Egypt and Seleucia and like Western Anatolia. That's where things are happening. And like Rhodes. Like the Greek nexus in that triangle of like trade, like, I mean, it's quite far away from Greek as well. Like it's basically Turkey, like Anatolia, right? Like it's more of an Anatolian island, actually.
Yeah. It's amazing how quickly they get eclipsed after like expanding so far and even like exporting their model so aggressively. It does make you think about the United States a little bit, like, you could like spread your influence and be a big deal for a little while and then like become irrelevant. Once the ball bounces a little further or things take a different turn, like it's very easy to like lose control of that process and in some ways become like irrelevant to it, which I think is definitely what happens by like the maybe the first, second century. I forget when Rome really officially swoops in.
When you're talking like ancient, like the
BC,
Roman Empire is like a totally different, like that is really like something where it's crazy that, I mean, I guess the Roman Empire really still is not irrelevant. But really like there's not really a comparison between Athens and the Roman Empire.
No, I'm talking about like Alexander's like realm and the Roman Empire. Like,
I mean, even that, like, that is much more impressive, and his legacy is crazy. But still, it's like a much more, ephemeral thing, I guess. That's it's short lived by comparison. But yeah, I mean, obviously, Alexander the Great, like the fact that like everybody knows who he was, like attests to what like a crazy conquest that was. So you can't really knock on him, but still, like to compare, you can't really compare what he achieved. Like what his that eventually basically deteriorated quickly after his death.
Right. The Romans built something much more enduring, partially based on some of these ideas, but they took it a lot further. And
I mean, I feel like the disintegration of the U.S.
Right? Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think next time we can talk about the rise of Rome and like its cycle of expansion and then collapse. I mean, the country that, as much as the ancient Greek stuff is kind of influential in the formation of the United States, the Roman Empire is like kind of a aspirational model, you see it really everywhere in, look at the capital,
Yeah, it's an interesting relationship because really it's like the fact that the ancient Romans, like in the elite classes, like they all spoke Greek and they kind of like adopted Greek culture. And there's like the whole parallel between, and to an extent, there's a whole parallel between the Greek gods and the Roman gods and everything. So like in that way, like that's kind of the reason why ancient Greece is important, is because of like its importance in Rome.
Exactly.
I mean, of course, like like within Rome, like more so than, I mean, obviously, like the Hellenistic world totally is important, but it's still like definitely because of the Roman Empire that ancient Greece has like the sort of cachet now that it has. But I think like if the United States, the disintegration of the U.S. empire, I mean, obviously it's kind of a parlor game to compare them, but if it were going to resemble the collapse of any historical empire, it will probably be similar to the Roman Empire. I think about it all the time, how like, just one day, like the roads they just suck, they're just like not as good anymore, like, and no one's coming to fix it. And that's just,
and I think the Roman Empire, what it does also, like just like on the sort of most naive and vulgar level, is that like it shifts the focus to the West, right? Otherwise, if you would have had Alexandria, Antioch, and Rhodes as like, a continuous thing, which is what the Germans during the classicist period there, during Goethe and stuff, like before Romanticism begins, when the bourgeoisie starts to imitate or wants to imitate the Roman Empire, like Rome to them was seen as like they destroyed this. They destroyed this beautiful thing that was the Hellenistic world, which was actually like a North African and a sort of like West Asian thing. Like it was, the Hellenistic world that they are, heralding is not centered on even the European continent. Like it's mainly like the eastern parts of the Mediterranean where you have like the coasts where today are like Libya, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, and then North Africa of like Egypt and like Tunisia, even like all the way to like the western Phoenician harbors, right, that go all the way to the Moroccan West End, right, like
right.
Yeah.
Well, I like I like you kind of referring at it as this like critical lake around which, in a way, these old Mediterranean societies like had a lot more, well, both contact and just like generally influence upon each other, and you could maybe say even in common with one another than like the northern parts of Europe at the time, or
sure,
England, or
totally.
or Scandinavia, or places that were still quite
this is kind of like the Braudel, like Annales school thing. It's crazy that this ever like was not like understood, but like the idea of like the Mediterranean world and like the Mediterranean as like the axis of like a world system, it makes much more sense than the idea of,
the water should be the continent somehow.
Exactly. It's kind of like someone was mentioning CLR James recently. It's kind of like the idea of the Black Atlantic and this type of stuff, like which is also like I think a good intervention. But
all right, well, I think we'll next time you come back, Marcus, good. we're gonna get into some Roman shit, but this is a lot of fun. This is very interesting.
I'm surprised you kept yourself entertained throughout. I'm It's not usually normal that you can talk about things like this for, man. Is it 4 hours? No, when did we start?
About 3. No. I think we hit about 3. Yeah.
Nice. It didn't even get boring. Like in a seminar, usually things get boring after like 40 minutes.
I mean, we definitely could have gone on longer. We unfortunately were like a little bit rushed, but next time hopefully we can try to start maybe a bit earlier. I don't know how early it is there, honestly, but if we can, then we can definitely go longer.
Sounds nice.
Yeah.
No, it's I hope it was a vibe for everybody in the chat. Thank you for watching, and we'll circle back soon for round 2.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'm looking forward to it a lot. I have to write another document.
It'll be. I don't want to force you to do that, but if you feel so compelled, it would be. It'll definitely be good if you do. It's actually a great kind of Virgil guide towards walking through these misty historical.
I want to calculate the wattage of water wheels. Like that's where I think we're gonna see. Like that's where the dialectics comes in and has a new trick for us that nobody foresaw. Well, kind of the Egyptians and the Sumerians did foresee the power of water, but like finally it's going to come to the temperate regions and slavery is no more, at least in the way that it defines everything. And then, throw in some Germans as well, some barbarians of the north.
We got to do it.
We got ourselves another episode.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for vibing with us, Marcus. And everybody else out there. We'll be back next Monday, but until then, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.
Bye-bye.